Hey guys, tonight we begin in a cold little village at the edge of the world. So dim the lights a bit, maybe grab a blanket, pretend you can smell damp wood smoke and wet sheep, and together we are going to slowly drift into the deeply exhausting experience of waking up as a medieval mother hiding her children from Vikings, which honestly already sounds like a terrible morning. You are tired. Permanently tired, medieval parent tired, the kind of tired where your spine has become a philosophical concept rather than a functioning body part. Outside, the wind is dragging itself over the hills like it also hasn't slept in years. And somewhere beyond the fog are ships. Probably. Maybe. Hopefully not. But also definitely yes. Because this is the Viking Age, and nobody in Northern Europe gets to relax for more than about 11 minutes at a time. You live near the coast of what we would now call Anglo-Saxon England, around the late 9th century, a time when kingdoms had names like Wessex and Mercia, and every man with a beard and a boat seemed emotionally committed to setting monasteries on fire. Not every Viking was raiding constantly, of course. Some traded, some farmed, some settled peacefully. But your village does not have the luxury of waiting to discover which category is currently rowing toward shore. And so, your life has become a long sequence of carrying children into forests while muttering prayers under your breath, which is difficult because there are so many children. There are always children. Medieval villages contain children the way ponds contain frogs, tiny, damp creatures everywhere, half of them sticky for reasons nobody understands. You have 5 living children yourself, which people consider a modest blessing, mostly because 2 others did not survive infancy, and everyone around you treats this as sad but normal. That's the first thing modern people would notice if they woke up here. The grief never really leaves. It just quietly sits in the corner spinning wool. Nobody talks about it much because if they did, absolutely nothing would get done. Your oldest son is around 12, which means people already speak about him like a small tax-paying adult. He owns exactly 1 tunic that fits properly and has recently become obsessed with carving little boats from scraps of wood. Wonderful, very comforting hobby at the moment. Your youngest still sleeps beside the hearth, wrapped in old wool making tiny wheezing sounds like a sleepy hedgehog. You love them all, with the terrifying intensity only exhausted parents understand. Which is unfortunate because the world around them is essentially held together with mud and anxiety. The village itself is a scattering of wooden homes with thatched roofs. Chickens wander through everything, smoke leaks from every opening. Nothing smells clean. The local pigs roam around freely eating scraps and occasionally terrifying toddlers. Nobody has privacy, nobody has silence, and nobody, absolutely nobody, has enough socks. You wake before dawn most mornings because survival is a group project now. The fire must be coaxed back to life, grain must be ground, water carried, bread prepared, wool spun, tools repaired, goats negotiated with emotionally. And somewhere in between all this, you try to prevent your children from accidentally dying in creative medieval ways, which is nearly a full-time occupation by itself. The river can kill them, the cold can kill them, disease can kill them, bad milk can kill them. Falling asleep slightly wrong can apparently kill them. Honestly, medieval childhood sometimes feels less like parenting and more like hostage negotiations with fate. Still, there are peaceful moments. The evening fires, the sound of rain on the roof, children sleeping together under heavy blankets while old stories drift through the hall. And sometimes you almost convince yourself life will continue quietly. Then somebody spots sails, and the entire emotional atmosphere changes immediately. It begins with rumor, always rumor. A fisherman heard of a monastery burned farther north. A trader says Danish ships were seen nearby. A shepherd swears he found footprints near the cliffs. Most rumors are false or exaggerated, but enough are true that nobody ignores them anymore. That's the exhausting part psychologically. You cannot stay terrified every single day. Human beings simply aren't built for permanent panic. Eventually, the mind becomes strangely practical about danger. You still bake bread while discussing possible raids. You still mend tunics while someone explains how an entire village was supposedly carried off into slavery. People nod thoughtfully during these conversations, then continue peeling onions, because dinner still has to happen. And this strange coexistence between terror and domestic routine becomes the defining rhythm of your life. Your husband spends more time away lately helping maintain local defenses. He owns a spear that looks deeply unimpressive. The iron head is chipped, the shaft slightly warped, yet everyone treats it with enormous seriousness because weapons are expensive. Everything made of metal is expensive. A good sword in this world is practically a luxury sports car. Most men fight with axes, spears, farm tools, or confidence. Sometimes only confidence, which historically has mixed results. At night, your husband sits near the fire speaking quietly with the other men about nearby settlements. Some have paid tribute to Viking leaders for protection. Some have fought. Some simply vanished. Nobody knows exactly what strategy works best because the Vikings themselves are not one unified force. Different groups want different things. Some want silver, some want land, some want power, some seem motivated purely by the exciting possibility of ruining everyone's week. And slowly, over years, fear settles into the bones of the countryside. Children learn hidden places before they learn prayers. Women prepare bundles of food that can be carried quickly. Valuable objects disappear beneath floorboards. You yourself have buried a small silver brooch near an old tree behind the village because your mother once told you invaders always search houses first. Whether this strategy truly works is unclear, but people cling to rituals when they cannot control outcomes. That, honestly, never changes throughout history. Modern humans do this too. We just call it productivity systems and skincare routines. One gray morning, before sunrise properly arrives, the dogs begin barking. Not normal barking, not fox barking, not stranger on the road barking. This is the sharp, frantic barking that pulls people instantly from sleep. Your husband is awake immediately. Every adult in the village knows this sound. Outside, movement spreads through the fog. Voices, feet, someone shouting from farther downhill. You grab the youngest child instinctively before fully understanding why. The baby begins crying. Of course, babies in history consistently demonstrate astonishing timing. Your husband pulls aside the door covering and peers into the half-light. Then comes the sentence every coastal mother dreads. Ships. Just that. One word. Flat and terrible. The village erupts into motion. No dramatic speeches, no heroic music. Just chaos. Children crying, people dragging sacks, animals shrieking, someone yelling for their brother, someone else already praying. You move automatically now because this has been rehearsed endlessly in conversations and fears. The older children are shaken awake. Shoes, cloaks, food bundle. Move. Move now. The plan is simple. Women, elderly people, and children flee inland toward wooded hills while the men remain behind long enough to slow raiders, or at least create confusion. It is not a good plan. It is simply the only available plan. You wrap the baby against your chest. Your daughter clings to your sleeve hard enough to hurt. Outside, smoke-colored dawn spreads over the village, and down beyond the shore, shapes. Long, narrow ships cutting through mist, dragon-headed shadows. You feel your stomach drop so suddenly it almost becomes physical pain. This is the thing all the stories were about. This. Not glorious battles, not kings, not legends, just mothers trying to keep children quiet while their entire world threatens to collapse. People often imagine history through rulers and wars, but most human beings in every century experience history exactly like this: confused, cold, carrying too much. You begin moving uphill with the others. The paths are muddy from rain. Small children stumble constantly. Somebody loses a shoe. One elderly woman refuses to leave without her chickens, creating an argument so intensely specific and emotional that even in this moment it almost becomes absurd. Finally, another woman physically drags her away while the chickens scatter triumphantly into the fog. And there it is, the strange humor of catastrophe. Human beings remain human even while terrified, especially while terrified. Your oldest son keeps looking back toward the shore. He wants to stay with the men. Of course he does. 12-year-old boys throughout history possessed an absolutely remarkable confidence despite understanding almost nothing. You grip his arm harder and continue climbing. The woods ahead are dense and wet. Families disappear between trees carrying bundles and babies. Nobody speaks loudly now. And slowly, beneath the panic, another emotion begins creeping in: waiting. Because once you hide, there is almost nothing else to do. You settle among damp undergrowth with several other families. Children whimper softly. One mother breastfeeds beneath a cloak while staring blankly into the distance. Another clutches a wooden cross so tightly her knuckles pale. Far below, faintly, comes the sound of shouting. Then smoke. Thin at first, then thicker. Your village, maybe burning, maybe not fully. Hard to tell through morning fog. Nobody moves. Nobody breathes properly. Time becomes strange in moments like this. Every minute stretches enormously. Your daughter eventually falls asleep against you despite everything. Children can sleep anywhere. Medieval children especially. Honestly, if historians could harness the sleep abilities of exhausted peasant toddlers, civilization might have advanced 300 years earlier. Hours pass. The men do not return. Some women begin quietly crying. Others remain perfectly expressionless in the way people sometimes do when emotions become too large to process. You think about your home, the bowls you inherited from your mother, the wool blanket still hanging beside the hearth, the little carved horse your son made last winter. Human beings become deeply attached to objects during unstable times, not because the objects matter enormously themselves, but because they prove continuity. They whisper, your life existed before this moment. At some point, rain begins falling softly through the trees. Perfect. Excellent addition to the experience. The baby wakes and cries again. You try desperately to quiet him. Every mother nearby immediately tenses. That's another brutal reality people rarely discuss. Children are loud. History is full of hiding families desperately attempting to negotiate silence from tiny humans who fundamentally oppose silence as a concept. Eventually, one older woman hands you a piece of cloth soaked lightly with watered ale to calm the child, which works surprisingly well because medieval parenting sometimes operated on principles modern pediatricians would describe as absolutely not. Still, it works. For now. Toward evening, figures finally emerge between the trees. Men. A few injured, a few missing. Your husband among them, alive. You almost collapse from relief. The village was raided. Several homes burned. Food stores taken. Livestock stolen. But many villagers survived because most had fled early, which in this era counts as fortunate. Fortunate. History has such depressing standards sometimes. That night, everyone remains hidden in the woods because nobody knows if the raiders will return. Cold rain drips steadily from branches. Children sleep in piles beneath cloaks. Adults stare into darkness. And here, in this miserable forest shelter, you begin understanding the deeper truth about Viking raids. The raids themselves are terrifying, yes, but the lasting damage comes afterwards. Fear changes communities permanently. People trust less, sleep less, store more, laugh more quietly. Every distant sail becomes a possible nightmare. And yet, life continues anyway, because humans are stubborn little creatures. The next morning, the villagers cautiously return downhill. Smoke still rises from several buildings. Your own home remains standing, though partially looted. The storage chest is broken open, most preserved food gone. Your buried silver brooch survives, however, so congratulations. Medieval paranoia pays off occasionally. Nearby, one family's house has burned completely. They stand staring at ashes with the hollow expression shared by disaster survivors across every century. No screaming, no dramatic collapse, just exhaustion. People immediately begin rebuilding because there is no alternative. Wood is gathered, roofs patched, animals counted. Children resume playing surprisingly quickly. That's another strange thing. Kids adopt with alarming speed. Within 2 days, your sons are already pretending to be Vikings while hitting each other with sticks. Human civilization truly hangs by a thread sometimes. The local priest arrives from another settlement several days later. He speaks solemnly about endurance and faith and suffering, then quietly asks whether any silver survived. Church officials across many centuries consistently maintain a fascinating awareness of financial matters. Still, religion matters deeply here. Not because medieval people were foolish, but because uncertainty dominates every aspect of existence. Faith provides structure when life feels random, and life here feels incredibly random. Winter sickness can wipe out half a household. A failed harvest can starve entire regions. One violent storm can destroy boats, crops, homes, and futures simultaneously. So yes, people cling to God. What else exactly are they supposed to cling to? As autumn deepens, stories spread from neighboring villages. More raids, more burned monasteries, more settlements paying tribute. And gradually, political power itself begins shifting. Local kings rise or fall based largely on whether they can protect people from Scandinavian armies. This is how enormous historical changes often happen, not through dramatic destiny speeches, but because ordinary mothers become tired of hiding children in forests. Eventually, leaders who provide stability gain loyalty. Those who fail lose everything. Meanwhile, daily life remains painfully ordinary. You still wake before dawn, still grind grain, still patch clothes, still worry constantly about food. And perhaps this is the strangest truth about history. Even during famous historical eras, most people spend nearly all their time doing chores. The Roman Empire? Laundry. The Renaissance? Taxes. The Viking Age? Wet bread and anxiety. One evening, months later, travelers arrive carrying news from farther north. A Danish leader has settled nearby lands permanently, not raiding now, settling, farming, trading, marrying local women. This confuses many villagers deeply because humans prefer simpler categories: enemy, friend, invader, neighbor. History rarely cooperates. Over time, Norse settlers and Anglo-Saxon communities increasingly mix. Languages blend, customs merge, trade expands. Children grow up speaking words from both cultures. And slowly, the terrifying foreign raiders become, in some places, simply people nearby. History softens at the edges like that, though not always peacefully. Your own children grow older in this strange transforming world. Your daughter learns spinning and weaving beside the hearth. Your sons begin helping with animals in fields. The oldest develops a fascination with ships that worries you enormously. Naturally. One snowy night, he asks what Vikings truly look like. You pause, because the honest answer is complicated. Some are brutal. Some are merchants. Some are farmers. Some probably miss their mothers. History becomes dangerous when humans flatten entire groups into monsters. Real people are always messier than that, even invaders. especially invaders. Years pass. Raids continue intermittently. So does life. Babies are born, fields planted, people marry, people die. Kings argue endlessly over territory while ordinary women continue carrying water through mud. At some point, your children stop being little, which feels impossible and inevitable simultaneously. Your oldest son eventually joins local fighters defending river routes. You barely sleep the night before he leaves. He looks so young holding a spear. Because he is young. History routinely places children into adult catastrophes and simply pretends this is normal. Your daughter marries into another village. You cry afterwards while pretending not to. Medieval mothers mastered silent crying mostly because houses contained approximately one room. Privacy remained theoretical. And gradually, you become older. Your hands rougher, your back worse. Your memories crowded with smoke and winters and births and funerals and fleeing into forests. You survive far longer than many women around you. No one calls it luck exactly, but it is. Always. The Vikings themselves change too. Many convert to Christianity eventually. Some become kings. Some become nobles. Some disappear into the tangled ancestry of Europe altogether. History absorbs conquerors surprisingly fast. And somewhere in your later years, while sitting beside a fire mending clothes for grandchildren, you realize something quietly strange. You no longer panic at every rumor of ships. You still fear them, but fear cannot.
Several winters pass before the next truly terrible year arrives. Not terrible in the dramatic movie sense. No giant flaming apocalypse. No giant flaming apocalypse. No narrator booming about destiny. Just the slow accumulation of problems, which is usually how history works, unfortunately. Rain falls too long. Crops weaken. A sickness moves through nearby villages. And rumors begin again. Always rumors. You are older now. Not old exactly, but medieval life measures age differently. By 35, your knees already sound like old floorboards and your hands permanently smell faintly of smoke, onions, and sheep. Your grandchildren visit often, small round creatures wrapped in wool and jam somehow. One of them keeps trying to eat candle wax. Another believes chickens are emotionally trustworthy companions despite overwhelming evidence otherwise. You love them with the exhausted softness that comes after surviving enough hardship to stop expecting peace entirely. The village itself has changed. Some houses are larger now. A few Norse traders regularly pass through the region. You occasionally hear Danish words mixed casually into conversation. Nobody even notices anymore. History blending itself together again. Messily, like stew. And yet, beneath this uneasy coexistence remains tension, because raiding never fully stops. It only pauses long enough for people to become hopeful again. Then comes spring, and with spring comes ships. Not directly at your village this time, farther inland, a monastery near the river. The news arrives with a terrified young monk who looks approximately 17 years old and emotionally unprepared for literally everything. Which is understandable. Most monks of this period entered monasteries expecting prayer, illuminated manuscripts, and perhaps mild gout in old age. Instead, many found themselves sprinting through forests while Scandinavians carried away church silver. The monk arrives soaked from rain and exhaustion. He speaks rapidly beside the fire while villagers gather around. The raiders came before dawn. Several buildings burned, relics stolen, books destroyed, and the abbot apparently attempted diplomacy before being hit with an axe handle. Not killed, just firmly disagreed with. The monk keeps repeating how terrible it all was. The villagers nod sympathetically, but also with the slightly practical expression of people silently thinking, yes, monasteries do keep storing enormous amounts of visible treasure in isolated locations. It's difficult not to notice the strategic flaw there. Monasteries during this period were strange places. On one hand, centers of learning, on the other, giant decorative loot boxes scattered across vulnerable coastlines. A difficult balance. Still, the attack unsettles everyone badly because holy places feel sacred, protected, or at least they're supposed to be. When holy places burn too, people begin wondering what exactly remains safe. The answer, historically speaking, is usually not much. Your grandson asks what relics are. You explain they are bones or possessions connected to saints. He thinks carefully about this, then asks why Vikings want saint bones. A reasonable question, honestly. The true answer is complicated. Silver containers, jewels, gold decorations, valuable objects attached to holy things. Also, Vikings did not necessarily view Christian sacred items with the same emotional reverence locals did. To them, a jeweled reliquary may have simply looked like an extremely expensive box, which, materially speaking, it was. Your husband spends longer periods away now assisting local defenses. His beard has gone partially gray. He hates this deeply. Men in every century cope badly with aging. Women too, of course, but medieval women usually lack time for prolonged emotional collapse about wrinkles because someone is always vomiting nearby. One evening, your husband returns with news about King Alfred of Wessex. Alfred, one of history's few rulers who actually earns the word great without immediately making everyone regret it. An astonishing rarity. Most kings throughout history should honestly be called things like Harold the Damp or Stephen the Poorly Organized. But Alfred genuinely matters, because while many rulers panic, flee, or spend invasions arguing about ceremonial nonsense, Alfred actually adopts. He builds fortified towns, organizes defenses, creates systems, reads books. A deeply suspicious amount of competence for a medieval king. Naturally, this makes many nobles uncomfortable. Competent administrators often ruin the traditional chaos aristocrats enjoy. Your husband explains that King Alfred wants stronger local coordination against Viking armies. More burhs, more fortified settlements, more planning. This sounds sensible to you, which means several important men immediately oppose it, because history repeatedly demonstrates that wealthy landowners will resist practical reforms if those reforms sound inconvenient enough. Still, Alfred persists, and slowly the kingdom changes. Roads improve slightly, defenses strengthen, messages travel faster. None of this feels dramatic in daily life, yet these boring administrative decisions shape history enormously. Civilization is often saved not by heroic speeches, but by organized paperwork. A deeply disappointing fact for movie directors. Meanwhile, your own life continues in its endless domestic orbit. You rise before dawn, bake coarse bread, spin wool, try to stop grandchildren from chasing pigs into dangerous places. The usual.
One particularly wet afternoon, traders from the Danelaw arrive. The Danelaw being regions controlled largely by Scandinavian settlers. They bring furs, amber, iron tools, and stories. Always stories. One trader speaks excellent Old English now. Another married a local woman years earlier and complains constantly about her mother's cooking, which honestly makes them sound exactly like every married couple across human civilization. The villagers remain cautious around them, but trade happens anyway. Fear and practicality coexist remarkably well. You notice something strange during these interactions. The Norse traders laugh more easily than expected. Not because Vikings are naturally cheerful, many historical accounts describe them as perfectly capable of brutality, but because real human beings are rarely emotionally consistent enough to remain terrifying all day long. One trader spends 15 minutes lovingly discussing sheep breeds. Another proudly shows tiny carved animals he made for his daughter. History becomes harder to simplify the closer you look, which is inconvenient for people who prefer neat moral categories. Your grandson asks one trader whether he has killed anyone. The entire room goes silent. The trader stares into his ale for a moment before answering quietly, "Yes."
Then he changes the subject to fishing. And there it is, the strange, uncomfortable humanity hiding beneath historical stereotypes. People who raid monasteries may also worry about their children catching fever. People who burn villages may also write poetry. Human beings are dreadful at staying inside narrative boxes. Summer arrives warm and muddy. Livestock graze peacefully. Children splash through streams. For several weeks, life almost feels normal, which should immediately concern everyone, because history dislikes prolonged calm. And indeed, another crisis soon wanders over the horizon wearing armor. A larger Viking army lands farther south. Not a quick raid now, an army. The kind that stays. The kind bringing wives, supplies, ambitions, and deeply unpleasant long-term intentions. Word spreads rapidly. Settlements begin fortifying again. Food hidden. Animals moved inland. And suddenly every conversation returns to survival. Your second son arrives unexpectedly one evening carrying news from nearby defenses. He looks exhausted, older than you remember. War does that quickly. Not only battles themselves, waiting for battles, marching, cold camps, watching friends die from infections caused by scratches. Pre-modern warfare was less glorious combat and more prolonged damp misery interrupted occasionally by screaming. He tells you several local nobles are arguing over strategy again. Of course they are. European aristocracy has always maintained an almost spiritual commitment to terrible timing. The Vikings, meanwhile, continue expanding river routes and settlements. Some fight, some negotiate, some simply settle wherever resistance appears weakest, and ordinary people get caught beneath these enormous political shifts like ants under moving furniture. One night, while heavy rain batters the roof, your family discusses whether to leave permanently. Move farther inland, safer territory perhaps. But safer territory usually already belongs to someone else, and abandoning land means abandoning survival. Fields represent life, identity, inheritance, ancestors. You cannot simply walk away easily. Besides, medieval travel is horrific. Modern people complain about airport seating while medieval roads casually attempted homicide. Mud everywhere, bandits, disease, broken carts, questionable inns containing fleas with strong political opinions. So most families stay put unless absolutely forced otherwise, which means history often traps ordinary people geographically while powerful men redraw borders around them. The following autumn becomes famous later among chroniclers, not because peasants suffer particularly more than usual, chroniclers rarely cared much about that, but because kings and armies finally collide dramatically enough for monks to start writing excitedly. You hear scattered reports of battles, victories, defeats, treaties, broken treaties immediately afterward because medieval diplomacy often functions like children promising not to steal pies anymore. Your husband returns injured one evening. Not catastrophic, a spear scrape along the arm, but infection terrifies everyone more than the wound itself. You clean it carefully with boiled herbs while he tries pretending it does not hurt. Medieval men remain emotionally committed to this performance for centuries. The wound heals eventually, barely. You spend weeks watching for fever, that constant hovering fear again, the awareness that minor injuries routinely become funerals. Around midwinter, refugees arrive from a burned settlement farther east, entire families carrying almost nothing, children barefoot in snow, one woman heavily pregnant. The villagers take them in because refusing would feel monstrous, though secretly everyone worries about food stores. Hospitality and panic make uncomfortable roommates. You speak often with one refugee mother near the fire. Her village resisted too long. Several men killed, homes destroyed. She describes hiding beneath reeds near a riverbank with her children while smoke covered the sky. You realize quietly that across England, women are repeating variations of the same story. Different rivers,
Different villages, same fear. History echoes like that. The refugee woman eventually admits something shameful in a whisper. During the escape, she briefly considered leaving behind one sick child to save the others. She didn't, but she thought it, and now guilt eats at her constantly. You understand immediately, because survival sometimes drags horrible thoughts through perfectly decent minds. Parenthood during catastrophe is largely impossible choices wrapped in exhaustion. The child survives, incidentally. Children in history either die suddenly from mild fevers or survive impossible conditions out of pure stubbornness. No consistency whatsoever. By now, Christianity spreads steadily among Scandinavian settlers too. Some genuinely convert. Others perhaps recognize strategic advantages. Probably both. Religion and politics spend most of history climbing into bed together anyway. A local Norse settler eventually sponsors construction of a small church nearby. Villagers find this deeply strange. A man who once raided Christian lands now funding Christian worship. But humans reinvent themselves constantly, sometimes sincerely, sometimes conveniently, usually both at once. The priest delivers sermons about forgiveness. Several villagers remain unconvinced, especially those whose relatives died during earlier raids. And honestly, fair enough. Reconciliation sounds noble until you personally remember someone setting your barn on fire. Still, life keeps blending cultures together. Your granddaughter grows up playing with children whose grandparents arrived from Scandinavia. Nobody finds this remarkable anymore. The children certainly don't care. Kids adopt faster than adults because they haven't yet spent decades organizing the world into emotional categories. One cold evening, a traveling storyteller visits the village hall. He recites tales from both Saxon and Norse traditions. Heroes, dragons, saints, sea monsters. Dozens gather around the fire listening, and you notice something almost comforting. Stories survive invasions surprisingly well. Even when kingdoms collapse, people still sit together at night wanting narratives about impossible things. Perhaps that's one of humanity's oldest instincts. Not conquest, not empire, just sitting in warm rooms while someone talks. Outside, snow drifts quietly across the dark fields. Inside, the storyteller describes Ragnarok, the end of the world in Norse mythology. Gods dying, the sky burning, chaos swallowing everything. The children listen wide-eyed, then immediately fall asleep halfway through, because children remain children even during mythological apocalypse discussions. Eventually, news arrives of Alfred's successes, victories against Viking forces, treaties negotiated, territories stabilized. Not perfect peace, but breathing room, the kind exhausted populations desperately crave. People celebrate cautiously. Nobody fully trusts stability anymore. Too many false dawns already. Still, hope returns, in small practical ways. Farmers plant more confidently. Trade routes reopen. Families repair homes more permanently. And for the first time in years, some villagers begin discussing future plans beyond mere survival. A remarkable psychological shift. You yourself begin teaching your eldest granddaughter spinning techniques your mother taught you long ago. Simple, repetitive work beside the hearth. Hands moving automatically. Outside, rain tops softly against the roof. And suddenly, you feel the weight of time enormously. Generations layered together. Your grandmother survived different wars. You survived Viking terror. Your grandchildren will survive something else entirely. Human history simply keeps handing anxiety to new people.
Several winters pass before the next truly terrible year arrives. Not terrible in the dramatic movie sense. No giant flaming apocalypse, no narrator booming about destiny, just the slow accumulation of problems, which is usually how history works, unfortunately. Rain falls too long, crops weaken, a sickness moves through nearby villages, and rumors begin again. Always rumors. You are older now. Not old, exactly, but medieval life measures age differently. By 35, your knees already sound like old floorboards, and your hands permanently smell faintly of smoke, onions, and sheep. Your grandchildren visit often, small, round creatures wrapped in wool and jam somehow. One of them keeps trying to eat candle wax. Another believes chickens are emotionally trustworthy companions, despite overwhelming evidence otherwise. You love them with the exhausted softness that comes after surviving enough hardship to stop expecting peace entirely. The village itself has changed. Some houses are larger now. A few Norse traders regularly pass through the region. You occasionally hear Danish words mixed casually into conversation. Nobody even notices anymore. History blending itself together again, messily, like stew. And yet beneath this uneasy coexistence remains tension, because raiding never fully stops. It only pauses long enough for people to become hopeful again. Then comes spring, and with spring comes ships. Not directly at your village this time, farther inland, a monastery near the river. The news arrives with a terrified young monk who looks approximately 17 years old and emotionally unprepared for literally everything, which is understandable. Most monks of this period entered monasteries expecting prayer, illuminated manuscripts, and perhaps mild gout and old age. Instead, many found themselves sprinting through forests while Scandinavians carried away church silver. The monk arrives soaked from rain and exhaustion. He speaks rapidly beside the fire while villagers gather around. The raiders came before dawn, several buildings burned, relics stolen, books destroyed, and the abbot apparently attempted diplomacy before being hit with an axe handle. Not killed, just firmly disagreed with. The monk keeps repeating how terrible it all was. The villagers nod sympathetically, but also with the slightly practical expression of people silently thinking, yes, monasteries do keep storing enormous amounts of visible treasure in isolated locations. It's difficult not to notice the strategic flaw there. Monasteries during this period were strange places. On one hand, centers of learning. On the other hand, giant decorative loot boxes scattered across vulnerable coastlines. A difficult balance. Still, the attack unsettles everyone badly because holy places feel sacred, protected, or at least they are supposed to be. When holy places burn too, people begin wondering what exactly remains safe. The answer, historically speaking, is usually not much. Your grandson asks what relics are. You explain they are bones or possessions connected to saints. He thinks carefully about this, then asks why Vikings want saint bones. A reasonable question, honestly. The true answer is complicated. Silver containers, jewels, gold decorations, valuable objects attached to holy things. Also, Vikings did not necessarily view Christian sacred items with the same emotional reverence locals did. To them, a jeweled reliquary may simply have looked like an extremely expensive box, which, materially speaking, it was. Your husband spends longer periods away now, assisting local defenses. His beard has gone partially gray. He hates this deeply. Men in every century cope badly with aging. Women too, of course, but medieval women usually lack time for prolonged emotional collapse about wrinkles because someone is always vomiting nearby. One evening, your husband returns with news about King Alfred of Wessex. Alfred, one of history's few rulers who actually earns the word great without immediately making everyone regret it, an astonishing rarity. Most kings throughout history should honestly be called things like Harold the Damp or Stephen the Poorly Organized, but Alfred genuinely matters, because while many rulers panic, flee, or spend invasions arguing about ceremonial nonsense, Alfred actually adapts. He builds fortified towns, organizes defenses, creates systems, reads books, a deeply suspicious amount of competence for a medieval king. Naturally, this makes many nobles uncomfortable. Competent administrators often ruin the traditional chaos aristocrats enjoy. Your husband explains that Alfred wants stronger local coordination against Viking armies, more burhs, more fortified settlements, more planning. This sounds sensible to you.
which means several important men immediately oppose it, because history repeatedly demonstrates that wealthy landowners will resist practical reforms if those reforms sound inconvenient enough. Still, Alfred persists, and slowly the kingdom changes. Roads improve slightly, defenses strengthen, messages travel faster. None of this feels dramatic in daily life, yet these boring administrative decisions shape history enormously. Civilization is often saved not by heroic speeches, but by organized paperwork, a deeply disappointing fact for movie directors. Meanwhile, your own life continues in its endless domestic orbit. You rise before dawn, bake coarse bread, spin wool, try to stop grandchildren from chasing pigs into dangerous places, the usual. One particularly wet afternoon, traders from the Danelaw arrive. The Danelaw being regions controlled largely by Scandinavian settlers. They bring furs, amber, iron tools, and stories, always stories. One trader speaks excellent Old English now. Another married a local woman years earlier and complains constantly about her mother's cooking, which honestly makes them sound exactly like every married couple across human civilization. The villagers remain cautious around them, but trade happens anyway. Fear and practicality coexist remarkably well. You notice something strange during these interactions. The Norse traders laugh more easily than expected, not because Vikings are naturally cheerful. Many historical accounts describe them as perfectly capable of brutality, but because real human beings are rarely emotionally consistent enough to remain terrifying all day long. One trader spends 15 minutes lovingly discussing sheep breeds. Another proudly shows tiny carved animals he made for his daughter. History becomes harder to simplify the closer you look, which is inconvenient for people who prefer neat moral categories. Your grandson asks one trader whether he has killed anyone. The entire room goes silent. The trader stares into his ale for a moment before answering quietly, "Yes." Then he changes the subject to fishing. And there it is, the strange, uncomfortable humanity hiding beneath historical stereotypes. People who raid monasteries may also worry about their children catching fever. People who burn villages may also write poetry. Human beings are dreadful at staying inside narrative boxes. Summer arrives warm and muddy. Livestock graze peacefully. Children splash through streams. For several weeks, life almost feels normal, which should immediately concern everyone, because history dislikes prolonged calm. And indeed, another crisis soon wanders over the horizon wearing armor. A larger Viking army lands farther south, not a quick raid now, an army, the kind that stays, the kind bringing wives, supplies, ambitions, and deeply unpleasant long-term intentions. Word spreads rapidly. Settlements begin fortifying again, food hidden, animals moved inland, and suddenly every conversation returns to survival. Your second son arrives unexpectedly one evening carrying news from nearby defenses. He looks exhausted, older than you remember. War does that quickly. Not only battles themselves, waiting for battles, marching, cold camps, watching friends die from infections caused by scratches. Pre-modern warfare was less glorious combat and more prolonged damp misery interrupted occasionally by screaming. He tells you several local nobles are arguing about strategy again. Of course they are. European aristocracy has always maintained an almost spiritual commitment to terrible timing. The Vikings, meanwhile, continue expanding river routes and settlements. Some fight, some negotiate, some simply settle wherever resistance appears weakest. And ordinary people get caught beneath these enormous political shifts like ants under moving furniture. One night, while heavy rain datters the roof, your family discusses whether to leave permanently, move farther inland. Safer territory, perhaps, but safer territory usually already belongs to someone else, and abandoning land means abandoning survival. Fields represent life, identity, inheritance, ancestors. You cannot simply walk away easily. Besides, medieval travel is horrific. Modern people complain about airport seating, while medieval roads casually attempted homicide. Mud everywhere, bandits, disease, broken carts, questionable inns containing fleas with strong political opinions. So most families stay put unless absolutely forced otherwise. which means history often traps ordinary people geographically while powerful men redraw borders around them. The following autumn becomes famous later among chroniclers, not because peasants suffer particularly more than usual, chroniclers rarely cared much about that, but because kings and armies finally collide dramatically enough for monks to start writing excitedly. You hear scattered reports of battles, victories, defeats, treaties, broken treaties immediately afterward because medieval diplomacy often functions like children promising not to steal pies anymore. Your husband returns injured one evening. Not catastrophic, a spear scrape along the arm, but infection terrifies everyone more than the wound itself. You clean it carefully with boiled herbs while he tries pretending it does not hurt. Medieval men remain emotionally committed to this performance for centuries. The wound heals eventually, barely. You spend weeks watching for fever, that constant hovering fear again, the awareness that minor injuries routinely become funerals. Around midwinter, refugees arrive from a burned settlement farther east, entire families carrying almost nothing, children barefoot in snow, one woman heavily pregnant. The villagers take them in because refusing would feel monstrous, though secretly everyone worries about food stores. Hospitality and panic make uncomfortable roommates. You speak often with one refugee mother near the fire. Her village resisted too long, several men killed, homes destroyed. She describes hiding beneath reeds near a riverbank with her children while smoke covered the sky. You realize quietly that all across England, women are repeating variations of the same story. Different rivers, different villages, same fear. History echoes like that. The refugee woman eventually admits something shameful in a whisper. During the escape, she briefly considered leaving behind one sick child to save the others. She didn't, but she thought it, and now guilt eats at her constantly. You understand immediately, because survival sometimes drags horrible thoughts through perfectly decent minds. Parenthood during catastrophe is largely impossible choices wrapped in exhaustion. The child survives, incidentally. Children in history either die suddenly from mild fevers or survive impossible conditions out of pure stubbornness. No consistency whatsoever. By now, Christianity spread steadily among Scandinavian settlers too. Some genuinely convert, others perhaps recognize strategic advantages. Probably both. Religion and politics spend most of history climbing into bed together anyway. A local Norse settler eventually sponsors construction of a small church nearby. Villagers find this deeply strange, a man who once raided Christian lands now funding Christian worship. But humans reinvent themselves constantly, sometimes sincerely, sometimes conveniently, usually both at once. The priest delivers sermons about forgiveness. Several villagers remain unconvinced, especially those whose relatives died during earlier raids, and honestly, fair enough. Reconciliation sounds noble until you personally remember someone setting your barn on fire. Still, life keeps blending cultures together. Your granddaughter grows up playing with children whose grandparents arrived from Scandinavia. Nobody finds this remarkable anymore. The children certainly do not care. Kids adopt faster than adults because they haven't yet spent decades organizing the world into emotional categories. One cold evening, a traveling storyteller visits the village hall. He recites tales from both Saxon and Norse traditions: heroes, dragons, saints, sea monsters. Dozens gather around the fire listening, and you notice something almost comforting. Stories survive invasions surprisingly well. Even when kingdoms collapse, people still sit together at night wanting narratives about impossible things. Perhaps that's one of humanity's oldest instincts. Not conquest, not empire, just sitting in warm rooms while someone talks. Outside, snow drifts quietly across the dark fields. Inside, the storyteller describes Ragnarok, the end of the world in Norse mythology. Gods dying, the sky burning, chaos swallowing everything. The children listen wide-eyed, then immediately fall asleep halfway through, because children remain children even during mythological apocalypse discussions. Eventually, news arrives of Alfred's successes, victories against Viking forces, treaties negotiated, territory stabilized. Not perfect peace, but breathing room, the kind exhausted populations desperately crave. People celebrate cautiously. Nobody fully trusts stability anymore. Too many false dawns already. Still, hope returns in small, practical ways. Farmers plant more confidently, trade routes reopen, families repair homes more permanently. And for the first time in years, some villagers begin discussing future plans beyond mere survival. A remarkable psychological shift. You yourself begin teaching your eldest granddaughter spinning techniques your mother taught you long ago. Simple, repetitive work beside the hearth, hands moving automatically. Outside, rain tops softly against the roof, and suddenly you feel the weight of time enormously. Generations layered together. Your grandmother survived different wars. You survived Viking terror. Your grandchildren will survive something else entirely. Human history simply keeps handing anxiety to new people wearing slightly different clothes. The older you become, the stranger memory feels. Certain terrifying moments remain sharp forever. The morning ships appeared through fog. The smell of smoke in wet forests. Children sleeping silently while adults waited for disaster. Yet entire years vanish into blur. Harvests, winters, bread, laundry, funerals. Human life is mostly repetition punctuated by catastrophe, not the other way around. One spring morning, you walk alone near the fields at dawn. Mist hangs low over the grass, birdsong drifts softly from hedges, and for a brief moment, the world feels astonishingly peaceful. No ships, no shouting, no smoke, just cold air and damp earth. You realize then something both comforting and sad. Most people throughout history probably experienced happiness exactly like this. Small, temporary, quiet enough to miss if distracted. Not grand triumphs, just ordinary mornings without fear. Back in the village, grandchildren already chase each other through mud while somebody yells about missing goats. Civilization continues, somehow, always somehow. And far away, kings still argue over territory while scribes scratch records onto parchment about victories and treaties and divine favor. But here, in the smoky warmth of the hall, life remains what it has always been. Children growing, women working, men worrying, soup boiling endlessly over fire, and tired mothers listening nervously whenever wind blows from the sea.
The fever, the marriage bed, and the deeply unfortunate royal family tree. By the time your hair begins turning fully gray, England itself has changed shape several times. Kings rise, kings die, kingdoms split apart and stitch themselves together again like badly repaired cloaks. And through all of it, ordinary people continue doing what ordinary people always do, trying to survive winter without losing too many children, a surprisingly universal human objective. You are a grandmother many times over now, possibly a great-grandmother. Honestly, medieval families become confusing quickly because everyone marries young and names repeat constantly. Half the village is called Ethel something. The other half answer to names that sound like someone sneezed into soup. Your eldest granddaughter recently gave birth after 2 miserable days of labor while 4 exhausted women shouted contradictory instructions around her. The baby survived. So did she. Everyone considers this a tremendous success, which it is. Childbirth in the medieval world is less a peaceful life event and more a medically unsupervised expedition directly into uncertainty. People speak softly around pregnant women for this reason. Too much can go wrong, and often does. Still, babies continue arriving. Humanity remains strangely committed to continuing itself despite overwhelming evidence that existence is exhausting. Outside your home now stands a slightly larger hall than the one from your youth. Several families prospered through trade with Norse settlements. Iron tools improved. River commerce expanded. Even clothing styles have shifted a bit. Cultures slowly folding into one another again. The grandchildren barely distinguish between Saxon and Danish anymore, unless adults specifically insist upon it. Children care more about whether someone shares food, a sensible political philosophy, honestly. One rainy evening, travelers arrive carrying stories from distant royal courts. And this is where history becomes especially strange, because while peasants struggle through mud and hunger, royal families spent enormous amounts of time arranging catastrophically complicated marriages, mostly between cousins, sometimes very close cousins, because apparently medieval monarchs looked at the concept of genetic diversity and collectively decided, no thank you. The travelers describe noble families across Europe marrying repeatedly into the same bloodlines to preserve alliances, land claims, and power, which sounds practical initially, until everyone resembles nervous potatoes with chronic jaw problems. Now, your village knows little about future dynasties yet. The truly legendary levels of royal inbreeding will come later. The Habsburgs eventually arrive like history's cautionary chill about family trees becoming circles. But already, noble houses are laying foundations for centuries of deeply unfortunate genetics. And honestly, even local villagers notice the weirdness sometimes. A nearby lord's son is described as frail, sickly, and possessed of a thoughtful nature, which are medieval euphemisms often meaning, this child looks like warm milk and may not survive winter. The boy apparently struggles walking long distances and faints during church services. Yet his family insists he is destined for greatness because aristocrats rarely allow reality to interrupt ambition. You hear these stories while mending clothes near the fire, and gradually conversation drifts toward marriage itself. Not romance. Nobody here expects romance particularly. Marriage is labor organization with occasional affection if lucky. People marry for land, security, alliances, survival. Love may appear later, or not. Your own marriage grew into companionship slowly over decades, not dramatic passion, just shared burdens, shared winters, shared grief, which honestly may be more durable. Still, among nobility, the situation becomes especially transactional. Princesses are moved across countries like fragile diplomatic parcels. Teenage girls promise to men twice their age because kingdoms require treaties. And boys raised believing they are divinely chosen despite possessing the emotional maturity of sleepy geese. And because royal bloodlines must remain pure, marriages grow increasingly tangled. One traveler mentions a Frankish noblewoman married first to one cousin, then, after his death, to another. Everyone nods thoughtfully. Apparently, this is normal now. You quietly think it sounds exhausting. The church technically objects to close blood relations in marriage sometimes, but royal families possess remarkable flexibility when interpreting rules benefiting themselves, a medieval specialty. Kings frequently request special permission from the Pope for cousin marriages, and somehow permission keeps appearing. Funny how that works. Meanwhile, ordinary villagers mostly marry whoever lives within walking distance and owns enough goats to survive famine, which honestly may produce healthier outcomes overall. Your grandson eventually marries a Danish girl from a nearby settlement. A generation earlier, this would have scandalized many people. Now, villagers mainly care whether she works hard and knows how to make decent bread. She does, so everyone relaxes quickly. Their wedding feast lasts 2 full days. Children run screaming through mud. Old men drink too much ale and argue about weather patterns from 20 years earlier. Someone plays a bone flute terribly. A beautiful medieval evening. You watch the newly married couple sitting beside the fire looking awkward and hopeful, still so young. And suddenly you remember your own wedding night decades ago, how frightened you felt leaving your childhood home, how little you understood about adulthood, how quickly life became responsibility. History often portrays medieval people as somehow emotionally simpler than modern humans, but fear feels timeless. So does love. So does uncertainty. One winter, a terrible fever spread through neighboring villages. Nobody understands disease scientifically yet. People discuss bad air, divine punishment, unlucky stars. Meanwhile, bacteria quietly continue their horrifying little hobbies entirely unnoticed. The fever begins with chills, then coughing, then heat so intense patients seem to burn from within. Several children die quickly, then older people, then strong, healthy adults too. That's what truly terrifies communities, when sickness ignores normal expectations. You spend weeks caring for ill relatives, boiling herbs, changing cloths, whispering prayers, sleeping barely at all.
The village priest moves constantly between homes, delivering blessings and last rites with increasing exhaustion. At one point, he accidentally blesses someone's goat. Nobody corrects him. People are too tired. Your granddaughter falls sick next. Young mother, 3 children. You sit beside her through long nights, listening to her breathing change. Waiting. Always waiting. Medieval illness involves enormous waiting. No real treatment, just hope balanced against dread. She survives eventually.
Barely. Another woman across the village does not, and afterward her husband wanders around for days looking stunned, as though reality itself has become confusing. Because grief in tight medieval communities is deeply physical. You see empty places immediately, at the well, near the ovens, beside the fire during evening meals. The dead leave shapes behind them. Eventually, the fever passes, as plagues and outbreaks often do, abruptly, cruelly, like storms wandering elsewhere. Life resumes, again. Human beings possess astonishing capacity for resuming routine after horror, perhaps because there is no alternative. One afternoon, traveling merchants bring tiny luxury items from distant regions, colored glass beads, fine cloth, little carved combs. Your youngest granddaughter becomes fascinated by a polished bronze mirror no larger than her hand. She stares at her reflection endlessly, which feels very human somehow. Across all centuries, give people reflective surfaces and they immediately become emotional about their faces. The merchants also carry stories from royal courts farther south. A prince kept isolated due to mysterious illnesses. A queen unable to produce surviving heirs despite 8 pregnancies. A duke rumored to faint at the sight of blood. Royal families remain endlessly dramatic despite possessing every material advantage available. And honestly, maybe because of it, too much power and isolation tends to make humans strange. Court life sounds miserable to you personally. Cold stone castles, constant politics, everybody spying, nobody trustworthy. At least village arguments usually concern missing cows rather than assassination. One merchant describes a particularly unfortunate young noble known for his magnificent chin. This description worries everyone immediately. Historically, compliments about royal appearance often hide deep concern. Apparently, the young man struggles chewing and speaks with difficulty, yet portraits flatter him enormously because court painters value continued employment, another timeless human tradition. You ask whether the noble is kind, at least. The merchant shrugs. He enjoys hunting, which feels like a diplomatic way of saying absolutely nothing useful. Meanwhile, your own husband grows older beside you, slower now. His hands ache in cold weather. He forgets names occasionally. Sometimes he stares into the fire for long periods, saying very little. You know he still remembers the raids from years ago, the smoke, the ships. Men rarely discuss fear openly in this world. Instead, they chop wood aggressively and develop mysterious back pain. One evening, he admits quietly that he no longer dreams about battles, only about searching for children in forests. That was what stayed with him, not fighting, fear. History remembers kings and warriors, but ordinary people remember sounds. Crying babies, rain on leaves, footsteps in darkness. As years drift onward, England itself slowly becomes more unified under stronger kingship. Not peacefully, of course. Nothing in medieval politics occurs peacefully if avoidable. Still, larger structures emerge. Laws, taxes, administration. The beginnings of something resembling centralized authority, which mostly means peasants now pay obligations more efficiently, civilization's oldest hobby. Your grandchildren grow into adults raising children of their own, and now you sit near the hearth telling stories about the early Viking raids as though discussing another lifetime, which in many ways it was. The younger children listen wide-eyed. To them, Vikings already feel half mythical. That happens surprisingly quickly. Real terror becomes folklore within generations. One boy asks whether Vikings truly wore horned helmets. You tell him no,
because even exhausted medieval grandmothers apparently must spend eternity correcting this nonsense. Some misconceptions never die. Outside, snow falls softly again. Your bones ache. The hall smells of stew and wet wool. And around you sits a family formed from cultures that once tried killing each other across muddy fields. Saxon blood, Danish blood, children carrying both. History mixing itself together quietly while rulers elsewhere obsess over purity and dynasties. Which brings us back, naturally, to royal families. Because while ordinary villagers adapt pragmatically, Europe's elites continue enthusiastically marrying cousins like it's a competitive sport. The consequences grow steadily stranger. Some royal children emerge healthy enough, others tragically fragile. Entire courts begin revolving around sickly heirs who cannot ride properly, produce children, or survive common illnesses. Yet dynastic pressure intensifies anyway. More cousin marriages, more negotiations. More painfully awkward wedding ceremonies involving teenagers who barely understand what country they're entering. One can almost feel future generations of genetic counselors screaming faintly across time. You hear of a noblewoman sent abroad at 14 to marry a foreign prince. She cries constantly from homesickness. Court officials interpret this as weakness, which seems unfair considering she has been transported hundreds of miles away to marry someone described only as serious-faced. Medieval diplomacy remains extraordinarily unkind to girls. Queens are expected to produce heirs rapidly and repeatedly, regardless of personal cost. If sons die, people blame the mother. If no sons arrive, people blame the mother. If political alliances fail somehow, still probably the mother. History grants royal women beautiful gowns occasionally, but almost no emotional mercy. You think about this often now while watching your granddaughters grow. Village life is hard, back-breaking hard, yet at least their futures contain familiar rhythms, fields, families, known landscapes, not terrifying foreign courts filled with suspicious nobles and deeply damp castles. One spring morning, long after the great raids of your youth, you wake before dawn, unable to sleep. The hall is quiet, only embers glowing faintly. Beside you, your husband snores softly like an elderly bear suffering philosophical disappointment. You step outside. Mist stretches across fields, silver and moonlight, and there, in the distance, you hear something unexpected. Church bells. Not alarm bells, not warning bells, just ordinary bells greeting morning. Peaceful, steady. No ships, no smoke, no running children. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, the sound does not immediately fill you with dread. The world remains dangerous, of course, always dangerous. Kings still scheme, diseases still spread, winter still kills the weak, and somewhere noble families continue producing increasingly bewildered-looking heirs through determined cousin marriage. But here, in this small patch of earth, life has softened slightly. Not easy, never easy, just quieter. And as dawn slowly brightens over muddy fields and sleeping houses, you realize something strangely comforting. Most people in history never knew they were living through famous eras. They simply woke each morning hoping loved ones survived another day. That was enough. Usually it had to be enough. So the bells continue ringing softly through the cold air. Children sleep, fires wait to be lit, and the long, tired world of medieval England drifts onward into another uncertain century. The Sea King, the lonely queen, and the catastrophic emotional intelligence of medieval men. By now, you are old enough that younger villagers occasionally speak around you as though you are part furniture. Not maliciously, just confidently. People assume elderly women stop noticing things. This is historically a terrible assumption. Old women in villages know everything. Who stole grain? Who secretly waters down ale? Which marriages are miserable? Which babies arrived suspiciously early after weddings? Civilization has always rested quietly upon grandmothers collecting information near ovens. Your own movements are slower now. Winter settles harder into your joints. Your hands ache during rainstorms before clouds even arrive, which feels deeply unfair but apparently normal. Still, you work. Everyone works until they physically cannot anymore. Retirement does not exist. The medieval pension system is essentially hope your children aren't awful. Fortunately, yours mostly turned out decent. Mostly. One grandson briefly attempted becoming a trader and lost half his goods because he trusted a man described by witnesses as extremely confident. A devastatingly medieval mistake. Confident idiots have survived every century remarkably well. Outside your village, England continues transforming again, because history never leaves anything alone long enough to stabilize properly. The children who once hid from Viking raids are now adults, governing regions together with descendants of those same Vikings. Norse earls hold land. Anglo-Saxon nobles marry Scandinavian families. Languages blend further. Even clothing styles shift. Some older villagers dislike these changes on principle. Old people throughout history often gaze at younger generations and conclude civilization itself is collapsing because tunics fit differently now. A timeless tradition. Meanwhile, the sea still matters enormously. The sea brings trade, fish, storms, invaders, news, disease, opportunity, death. Everything arrives eventually by water. Your youngest surviving son works seasonally in your river ports now. He returns periodically with stories from coastal towns where cultures mix so thoroughly nobody can entangle them anymore. He describes markets filled with English, Danish, Frisian, and Norse voices all shouting simultaneously over barrels of fish. Apparently, the smell is horrifying. Some things transcend culture. One evening, he tells you about King Knut, or Canute depending on who is telling the story and how dramatic they feel. A Danish ruler who eventually becomes king of England, which would have seemed impossible during your youth when Viking ships first appeared through fog like floating nightmares. And yet, here you are, a Viking king ruling England. History enjoys irony enormously. Now, later generations often remember Canute mostly because of the famous tide story, the king placing his throne beside the sea to demonstrate he could not command the waves, though some versions wrongly portray him as foolish enough to believe he literally could, which misses the point entirely. The story actually suggests surprising humility for a medieval ruler. Again, suspiciously competent behavior. But your son says people speak well of Canute. Overall, strong ruler, organized administration, relatively stable reign. He even supports the church generously, which probably helps public relations after generations of Scandinavians spent considerable time robbing monasteries. A smart political adjustment, honestly. And gradually, you realize something strange. The terrifying foreign invaders of your youth have become kings, nobles, merchants, neighbors. Human beings normalize astonishing transformations if given enough decades. Still, beneath these political shifts remain ordinary private tragedies, because medieval life continues grinding people down quietly. A woman across the village loses 2 children during winter sickness, one after another. Small graves in frozen earth. The mother barely speaks for weeks afterwards. Nobody pressures her to move on because medieval people understand grief too intimately for that nonsense. Loss lives openly here. Death sits at every table eventually. People simply continue working beside it. You visit the grieving mother often, not with advice. Advice rarely helps. Mostly you sit beside her spinning wool while she stares into the fire. Companionship matters more than wisdom during sorrow. Another timeless human truth. Meanwhile, royal courts continue generating emotional disasters at astonishing speed. Travelers bring stories constantly now because trade routes are safer under stronger kingdoms. One tale concerns a queen married abroad to secure peace between rival dynasties. She arrives young, foreign, unable to speak the language properly, immediately surrounded by suspicious courtiers evaluating her fertility like nervous farmers inspecting livestock, which is essentially the royal woman experience throughout much of history. Her husband, the king, apparently possesses all the emotional sensitivity of damp bread. He ignores her publicly for months while openly favoring hunting companions and political advisors, then suddenly demands heirs as though children emerge magically from atmospheric conditions. Medieval royal men consistently demonstrate remarkable confusion about women despite spending enormous effort marrying them. The queen eventually bears several children. 2 die young, 1 survives. Court factions immediately begin plotting around the surviving child because aristocrats cannot experience a birth without converting it into political chaos. You listen to these stories while peeling onions beside the hearth.
And honestly, the whole thing sounds exhausting. Royal life appears glamorous only from very far away. Up close, it resembles a permanent family argument conducted in freezing stone buildings. One particularly wet autumn, your granddaughter travels with her husband to a larger town farther south. When she returns weeks later, she brings fascinating gossip. Apparently, noble women now wear increasingly elaborate hairstyles involving braids, pins, ribbons, and architectural determination. Some styles take hours to arrange. This seems deeply impractical to you personally. You spent most of your life trying to keep hair away from open flames and muddy children. But every generation invents unnecessary fashion suffering eventually. Your granddaughter also describes courtly behavior becoming more refined in wealthier regions, more rituals, more etiquette, more tiny rules determining where people sit, stand, eat, and breathe. Humans with power adore complicated social systems because simplicity risks equality accidentally breaking out. Meanwhile, peasants remain too busy surviving for elaborate manners. If someone shares food and doesn't steal your goat, village society generally considers them acceptable company. Winter arrives brutally that year. The cold settles early and refuses leaving. Rivers freeze, livestock weaken, wood becomes precious. People sleep packed together for warmth beneath layers of wool and animal fur, while wind claws at walls outside. Your husband develops a terrible cough, deep, persistent, the kind older people recognize immediately but rarely discuss openly. You sit awake many nights listening to him breathe, waiting between coughs, counting silence. Fear changes shape with age. When young, you fear invasion, famine, childbirth. When older, you fear absences in the night. He survives the winter somehow, thinner though, quieter. One evening beside the fire, he admits he never expected reaching old age. Not after the raids, not after the battles, not after all those winters. You understand perfectly. Many medieval adults carry survivor's guilt without possessing words for it. Too many friends buried, too many children lost, too much randomness deciding who continues. Outside, snow falls softly through darkness. Inside, grandchildren sleep curled together like puppies beneath blankets, and for a while, the world feels strangely gentle. Then politics arrives again to ruin everything, because now comes succession trouble, always succession trouble. A nobleman dies without clear heirs nearby. Several families claim rights to his lands. Arguments escalate. Local violence spreads. Suddenly, armed men wander roads again, demanding loyalty oaths from exhausted farmers who mainly want everyone to stop trampling barley. This is another brutal reality about medieval power struggles. Nobles wage disputes. Peasants absorb consequences. One local lord recruits aggressively among young men, promising glory and silver. Your youngest grandson becomes fascinated immediately because young men throughout history remain tragically vulnerable to speeches involving honor. You forbid him from joining. He sulks dramatically for days, claims you don't understand, which is particularly irritating because understanding is precisely the problem. Eventually, his father intervenes by assigning him endless fence repairs until revolutionary ambitions fade. Physical labor solves many teenage identity crises historically. Around this time, stories spread about strange happenings within continental royal families farther south. A prince too sickly to rule, a queen rumored infertile after years of marriage, a child born with deformities interpreted as divine signs. Medieval courts remain deeply superstitious. Every illness becomes symbolic, every birth an omen. Modern people sometimes imagine science replacing superstition neatly, but honestly, humans still interpret random events emotionally all the time. We just use different vocabulary now. One merchant describes a particularly tragic young queen married at 13 to cement an alliance. She spends most of her short life pregnant,
8 births, only 3 surviving children, dead before 30. Court poets later describe her as delicate and graceful, which feels like history politely refusing to acknowledge she was essentially worked to death by dynastic expectations. You think often about royal women now, not because their lives resemble yours. Materially, they do not, but emotionally, the fear for children, the exhaustion, the loss of bodily autonomy, the pressure to survive within systems built by men. Those parts remain strangely familiar. One spring, your village hosts travelers from Normandy, tall men speaking accented French and carrying themselves with enormous confidence, despite wearing some deeply questionable haircuts. They describe Duke Richard's court across the sea. More marriages, more alliances, more noble drama. Apparently, one aristocratic couple despise each other so intensely they communicate mostly through servants despite living in the same castle, which honestly sounds emotionally advanced by medieval standards. At least they found a system. The Norman travelers also bring wine, terrible wine, sour enough to remove paint. Everyone drinks it anyway because imported goods automatically seem sophisticated. Human psychology never changes. Your eldest great-grandson asks whether kings are happier than ordinary people. You consider this carefully, then answer honestly, no. He seems surprised. Children assume power protects against sadness. Adults eventually learn otherwise. In truth, many rulers appear profoundly lonely, surrounded constantly by people yet trusting almost nobody, raised from childhood to view marriage as politics, friendship as strategy, affection as vulnerability. Royal courts produce magnificent buildings and deeply damaged humans in roughly equal measure. As years continue drifting onward, Christianity grows even stronger across former Viking territories. Churches expand, monasteries rebuild richer than before somehow. Monks resume copying manuscripts while hoping Scandinavians remain spiritually committed to not burning them again. Progress. Your village priest grows old alongside you. He now complains endlessly about younger clergy lacking discipline, another eternal human pattern. One evening, he admits privately that the world feels less frightening than during his youth. Not safe, exactly, just steadier. You realize you agree. The terror of sudden raids has faded gradually into memory. Now, dangers arrive more slowly. Taxes, politics, disease. Still awful, but less likely to appear from sea mist holding axes. And that changes something deep within communities. Children play farther from home now. People rebuild with more confidence. Farmers invest effort into better fields instead of assuming everything may burn next spring. Hope quietly reshapes behavior. One cold night, your family gathers for a feast, celebrating a successful harvest. Candles flicker, stew boils, ale passes freely. Somebody plays music slightly off rhythm. Children fall asleep against adults halfway through conversations. You sit watching generations spread around the hall. Descendants of frightened villagers who once hid in forests from Viking ships. Descendants also of Vikings themselves now. All together, laughing, arguing about bread, complaining about weather. History folding enemies into family eventually. Not always, but sometimes. Your husband reaches for your hand beside the fire, old scarred hand, warm despite winter, and suddenly you feel the enormous, strange weight of surviving long enough to become part of history rather than merely trapped inside it. Most people never realize historical eras end while living through them. The fear simply fades gradually. New problems arrive, children grow, and one day the nightmares of youth become stories told to sleepy grandchildren while rain tops softly against the roof. Outside, the sea still moves endlessly in darkness, cold, restless, indifferent. But tonight, no ships emerge from the fog, no bells ring warning through the village. Only wind, only distant waves, and the quiet breathing of a world temporarily at peace with itself. The king who couldn't decide, the bread that could break teeth, and the long, slow ending of your world. You wake before dawn, Mao,
because old age has finally done what Viking raids, famine, childbirth, and decades of hard labor could not. It has turned sleep into a suspicious rumor. Your body hurts in highly specific locations every morning. Your knees ache when rain approaches. Your hands ache when cold approaches. Your back aches continuously out of loyalty to tradition. Still, you rise. Because medieval life does not pause gently for aging. The fire still needs tending, water still carried, bread still baked into dense little bricks capable of surviving minor military assaults. People romanticize old-fashioned bread until they actually encounter medieval bread. Then suddenly everyone misses modern dentistry. Outside, the village slowly wakes beneath gray morning mist. Roosters complain dramatically. Dogs bark at nothing. Someone nearby is already arguing with a goat. Civilization continues. Your husband sits near the hearth, wrapped in wool, staring thoughtfully at the fire. He speaks less these days. Not unhappily, just tired. You understand. After surviving enough years, people stop rushing to fill silence. Silence becomes comforting eventually, especially after raising children. Across England, politics continue performing their usual exhausting dance. Kings die, new kings arrive. Nobles swear loyalty enthusiastically before betraying someone almost immediately afterward. The great wheel of medieval government turns onward, powered primarily by ambition and poor communication. Word reaches your village about Athelred, later remembered somewhat unfairly as the Unready, though the name actually means poorly advised rather than personally unprepared. Still, history has never missed an opportunity for accidental insults. Poor Athelred spends much of his reign dealing with renewed Viking pressure, because apparently England collectively learned absolutely nothing from previous centuries. New Scandinavian raids begin increasing again, not always huge attacks, sometimes just quick, brutal strikes along the coast. The old fear creeps back into villages like dampness returning through cracked walls. You notice it immediately in people your age. The younger generation treats raids as frightening political events, but older survivors react differently, instinctively. The sound of distant horns, rumors of ships, suddenly old men grip tools tighter, old women begin hiding valuables automatically. Trauma sleeps lightly. One evening, your grandson arrives from market carrying troubling news. A large Danish fleet has been sighted farther south, villages burned again, tributes demanded, and King Athelred's advisors apparently disagreeing about everything as usual. Of course they are. No historical crisis is complete with wealthy men holding deeply unhelpful arguments indoors while peasants panic outdoors. The village gathers that night in uneasy silence. You look around the hall and realize most younger adults cannot fully understand what the older generation feels right now, because memory changes fear. To the young, raids are stories becoming reality. To you, they are reality returning. That difference matters. Your husband quietly checks the old spear still hanging near the wall, rusty now, mostly symbolic. Still, he checks it. You say nothing. Outside, rain taps softly against the roof, while smoke curls lazily upward into darkness. And suddenly, it feels like the world has folded backwards through time, again. Human history often does this. People imagine progress as steady upward movement, but entire generations frequently experience life as repetition instead. War returning, disease returning, political stupidity returning with astonishing reliability. A week later, refugees arrive from the coast, another burned settlement, another terrified cluster of families carrying bundles through mud. One woman clutches a bird cage containing exactly one furious chicken. Nobody questions this. After enough disasters, humans become very accepting about emotional support poultry. The refugees describe chaos, Danish warriors moving inland quickly, local defenses collapsing, smoke visible for miles. Your grandchildren listen with pale faces. Now they finally understand the stories you once told beside winter fires. Fear has become real to them too. You watch your youngest great-granddaughter sleeping that night and feel something heavy settle inside you. Not panic exactly, exhaustion.
a lifetime of watching history repeatedly devour ordinary people. Kings negotiate, armies maneuver, and always mothers end up carrying children through rain afterward. One afternoon, a traveling priest brings news from the royal court. Athelred has ordered enormous payments to Danish leaders in exchange for peace. Danegeld, silver paid so raiders will leave temporarily. The villagers react with mixed emotions: relief, anger, resignation, because everybody understands the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes paying invaders works briefly, and sometimes it simply convinces more invaders to arrive. Human beings consistently struggle with problems involving aggressive men discovering easy profit. The priest also mentions growing tension within the royal family itself: succession worries, political rivalries, noble factions whispering constantly. Medieval courts remain emotionally incapable of stability for more than 6 consecutive months. Meanwhile, ordinary people continue doing laundry in rivers and hoping not to starve. The contrast feels absurd sometimes. One evening, your granddaughter asks whether kings truly matter as much as priests claim. You think carefully before answering. Yes, you finally say, but not in the way they think. She waits quietly. A bad king makes ordinary life harder, you explain. A good king mostly allows ordinary life to continue, which is perhaps the best definition of competent government across any century. The following winter becomes especially harsh. Food stores run low. Several elderly villagers die quietly in their sleep. Not traumatic deaths, just bodies finally surrendering after long, difficult lives. Medieval communities are very familiar with death, yet each loss still alters the emotional texture of a place. An empty chair, a silent corner, a missing laugh during supper. You attend funeral after funeral now. Cold earth, church bells, muted prayers drifting through fog. And gradually you begin noticing how many people you once loved exist only in memory. Your mother, friends from childhood, babies buried decades ago, entire generations fading softly into the ground beneath familiar fields. History books rarely mention this emotional reality, that most people spend old age carrying invisible crowds of ghosts beside them. Around this time, stories spread about a remarkable royal woman elsewhere in Europe, Emma of Normandy, a noblewoman married to King Athelred himself, and later, because medieval politics apparently enjoy emotional chaos, married to the Danish king Canute afterward. Imagine surviving one husband's collapsing kingdom only to marry the conqueror next. History truly refused women peaceful careers. Emma becomes famous partly because she adopts so effectively. Different kings, different courts, different political disasters, yet she survives them all. You admire her quietly, not because queens live comfortably, but because surviving royal politics may actually require stronger nerves than surviving Viking raids. At least invaders usually announce themselves eventually. Courtiers smile while plotting, far more exhausting. Your village priest describes Emma as intelligent and ambitious. Some men say this admiringly, others say it suspiciously. History often reacts nervously to capable women. One rainy morning, your husband collapses while carrying wood. Not dramatic, no sudden cinematic moment. He simply sinks slowly onto a bench afterward, breathing hard and looking terribly old. You sit beside him in silence. Neither of you say the obvious thing aloud. The body eventually collects payment for survival. After that day, he works less, sleeps more. Sometimes he forgets conversations entirely. You begin helping him dress during colder mornings. Marriage becomes gentler in old age, less passion perhaps, more quiet maintenance of another human soul. You realize you now love him differently than when young, more deeply, less urgently, like part of the landscape itself. Outside, England continues sliding toward enormous change again. Danish power grows stronger. Athelred struggles. Nobles switch loyalties constantly depending on which direction victory currently appears to lean. Political flexibility, they call it. Cowardice, others call it. Usually both. Your grandson eventually joins local defenses despite your fears, not from youthful excitement now, from responsibility. That is somehow worse. Young men chasing glory at least possess ignorance. Older men marching toward danger understand consequences fully. Before leaving, he kneels beside your chair and asks whether you think England will survive. Such a huge question. You almost laugh, not cruelly, just tiredly. England changes, you tell him. That's not the same thing as ending. He thinks about this for a long time, then nods and leaves before dawn with other village men disappearing slowly into gray mist, carrying spears and fear together. You watch them go while cold wind pulls at your cloak, exactly as you once watched your husband leave decades earlier. History repeating itself again, only slower now. Everything slower, even grief. Months pass uncertainly. Confusing reports arrive constantly. Battles won, battles lost, kings fleeing, alliances forming, breaking immediately afterward. At one point, people genuinely seem unsure who rules England anymore, an extremely medieval situation. Eventually, the news settles. Canute becomes king. The Danish ruler now governs England officially, and strangely, the world does not end. Taxes continue, markets reopen, church bells still ring, children still chase chickens through mud. This surprises nobody older. You learned long ago that ordinary life often survives enormous political transformations almost untouched. Rulers change faster than weather. Daily labor remains. One afternoon, you sit outside in weak autumn sunlight beside your great-grandchildren. The youngest climbs into your lap smelling faintly of smoke and milk. Far away, sheep move slowly across hills silvered by mist. And suddenly you realize something quietly extraordinary. You have lived long enough to see invaders become rulers, rulers become history, and frightened children become grandparents themselves. Entire worlds transformed within one lifetime. Most people never expect that. The child in your lap asks whether Vikings are still dangerous. You smile faintly. What people call dangerous changes, you answer. A frustrating grandmother response, perhaps, but true. The sea kings who once terrified England now wear crowns and issue laws. Their grandchildren speak English, pray in churches, argue about taxes. History domesticates conquerors eventually. Or perhaps conquerors domesticate history. Hard to say. Your husband dies during early spring, quietly, in sleep. After a final winter beside the fire, he survived far longer than anyone expected. You wake beside him before dawn and understand immediately. The stillness feels different. The hall feels different. The world feels briefly impossible. Villagers gather quickly after the bells ring. Your sons carry him. Your daughters weep openly. Grandchildren stand awkwardly unsure how grief should look. You sit through the funeral numb with exhaustion more than sorrow, not because you loved him less, because loving someone for decades changes mourning. It becomes too large for dramatic displays, more like losing weather or earth beneath your feet. That night, the hall feels unbearably quiet. You stare into fading embers, remembering all the versions of him layered across memory. Young fighter, gripping a spear. Exhausted father holding babies. Gray-haired grandfather laughing softly near winter fires. Old man sleeping beside you while storms rattled walls outside. A whole human life condensed eventually into silence and memory, which seems impossibly unfair. Outside, spring rain falls gently over fields where generations already sleep beneath the soil. And still, the world continues. It always continues. Children wake hungry. Animals require feeding. Bread must be baked, even after heartbreak, especially after heartbreak. In the months following his death, you drift slowly through familiar routines.
sometimes peaceful, sometimes unbearably lonely. Your grandchildren visit constantly now, worried about leaving you alone too long. You pretend finding this unnecessary. Secretly, you are grateful. One evening, your eldest great-grandson asks what frightened you most in life. You expect yourself to answer the raids, or famine, or sickness. Instead, you hear yourself say something else, outliving people. The boy grows quiet, because children rarely imagined old age clearly. They think fear belongs mostly to youth. But old age contains its own terrors. Watching worlds vanish, watching names disappear from conversations, becoming the last keeper of certain memories. Outside, darkness settles softly over the village. The same village you once fled, carrying children through smoke and rain. Now calmer, larger, changed beyond recognition, and yet somehow still itself. And there, beside the hearth, surrounded by descendants born from centuries of fear and survival and adaptation, you close your tired eyes for a moment, listening to distant waves beyond the hills. The sea is still there, cold, restless, eternal. But tonight it carries no ships toward shore.
The widow, the winter saints, and the strange quiet after fear. Widowhood arrives strangely, not all at once. People imagine grief as dramatic storms of emotion, and sometimes it is, but often it is smaller than that, more repetitive. You wake before dawn reaching towards someone who is no longer there. You hear a joke in the village and turn instinctively to share it. You save the larger piece of bread without thinking, then remember, again, and again, and again. Your hall feels too large now, despite being filled constantly with family. The empty place beside the fire glows louder than conversation. Still, life continues pressing forward with almost insulting determination. Goats escape fences, children scrape knees, rain leaks through roofs. One grandson develops an ambitious but deeply misguided plan involving eel traps and nearly drowns himself in knee-deep water. The usual. The world never pauses respectfully for personal sorrow, which feels cruel when young. Later, you understand it differently. Continuation itself becomes comforting eventually. Outside, England settles awkwardly beneath King Canute's rule, and surprisingly, things stabilize. Not perfectly. Nothing medieval is ever perfect except perhaps mud, but roads grow safer, trade improves, laws become more organized. People sleep easier. The great, terrifying Viking threat of your youth now sits wearing a crown and issuing tax policies. History truly possesses a bizarre sense of humor. Canute himself gains a reputation for practicality. He supports churches generously, maintains order, punishes rebellious nobles, which means ordinary villagers increasingly approve of him, because peasants across all centuries mainly desire three things from rulers. Please reduce chaos, please stop wars nearby, please do not raise taxes so high everyone eats bark. A surprisingly difficult standard for many governments historically. One afternoon, your granddaughter returns from market carrying imported honey cakes from a larger town, expensive little things, dense and sticky. Everyone pretends they are magnificent, though one child quietly spits his piece into the rushes when nobody looks. Human beings have always lied politely about luxury food. The market itself, she says, is thriving now. English merchants trading beside Danish settlers, Christian priests blessing Norse traders, children with mixed accents running between stalls. The old boundaries fading more each year. Sometimes you sit listening to younger generations speak and realize they inhabit an entirely different emotional world than the one from your youth. They do not remember the first raids, the panic, the forests. To them, Danes are simply neighbors now. Some annoying, some kind, most ordinary. And perhaps that is how history heals, not through speeches,
not through treaties, but because children eventually grow up without inheriting every hatred their grandparents carried. Though admittedly, humans remain inconsistent about this lesson. Winter settles heavily again, the kind of winter where frost creeps along walls inside the hall and every bucket of water develops opinions about becoming ice. You spend long evenings near the fire telling stories to great-grandchildren. Not heroic stories, they prefer the strange ones. The time a pig wandered into church during prayers, the monk who accidentally blessed a barrel of onions, the neighbor who tried curing tooth pain with garlic and nearly poisoned himself. Children love ridiculous details, perhaps because ridiculousness makes the past feel human. One boy asked whether kings ever felt afraid. You answer immediately, constantly, and it is true. Power rarely removes fear, it usually multiplies it. Kings fear betrayal, queens fear infertility, nobles fear losing favor. Everyone fears sickness. And beneath all the crowns and jewels and ceremonies, medieval rulers remain deeply anxious human beings trapped inside systems they barely control. You hear fresh stories from continental Europe now too, dynasties growing increasingly tangled, marriages negotiated between families already related 3 different ways. One royal child apparently suffers seizures interpreted by some as divine visions. Others whisper about curses. Nobody mentions genetics because medieval science remains approximately 600 years away from solving that particular mystery. Still, patterns become difficult to ignore eventually. Fragile heirs, strange illnesses, children born weak, courts quietly panicking over succession again and again. One traveling clerk describes a noble prince with such severe jaw problems he struggles eating publicly. Yet court poets continue praising his noble profile. The dedication to aristocratic denial is genuinely impressive. Your eldest granddaughter asks whether noble blood is truly superior like priests sometimes claim. You stare at her for a moment, then laugh so suddenly your chest hurts. My dear, you say, I have spent 70 years hearing stories about nobles fainting from horse rides and dying after eating bad oysters. She laughs too, because by old age, hierarchy begins looking less convincing. You have seen too many powerful people die helplessly from fevers. Too many peasants survive impossible winters through sheer stubbornness. Life distributes suffering with remarkable lack of respect for status. Spring eventually returns. Cold mud everywhere. Lambs stumbling through fields looking shocked by existence. The village priest declares this symbolic of innocence and renewal. Privately, everyone thinks the lambs mostly resemble damp socks with legs. Still, people feel hopeful again. Spring does that. Even exhausted old hearts respond slightly to sunlight after endless gray months. You begin walking shorter distances now. Your breathing sometimes catches unexpectedly, and occasionally you lose words mid-sentence like birds suddenly flying away. The children notice before you do. They hover nearby more often, carry heavier buckets without being asked, watch you carefully when stairs appear. A strange reversal. You once guarded them from the world. Now they quietly guard you. One evening during supper, a traveler arrives carrying enormous political news. King Canute has died. Immediately, the room fills with groans. Not grief exactly, more exhaustion, because everyone understands what follows royal deaths. Confusion, competing claims, ambitious nobles behaving terribly, civil disorder arriving enthusiastically through the front door. And indeed, trouble begins almost immediately. Succession disputes, regional tensions, foreign claims, England preparing once again to become history's favorite chewing toy. The younger villagers argue late into the night about which claimant deserves loyalty. You sit silently spinning wool. Old age teaches you something uncomfortable about politics. Most rulers eventually disappoint somebody, often everybody. Still, uncertainty spreads quickly through communities. Merchants hesitate, prices rise, men whisper around fires again. And beneath it all returns that old familiar sensation, waiting for disaster.
You hate how quickly the feeling comes back, like a scar aching before rain. One stormy night, your great-granddaughter wakes crying from nightmares about raiders. She has never seen a raid, only heard stories. Still, fear travels through generations easily. You hold her near the fire while wind rattles the walls outside, and softly, sleepily, you tell her something you wish someone once told you. The world has always been frightening, you whisper, and people have always continued anyway.
She falls asleep against your shoulder. Children trust reassurance so completely. A heartbreaking thing. Meanwhile, Europe continues generating catastrophically dramatic royals at industrial speed. A foreign queen reportedly locks herself in prayer for hours, fearing God punished her with daughters instead of sons. A duke divorces one cousin to marry another cousin for political advantage. Several royal children die from illness before age 10, while physicians recommend increasingly horrifying treatments involving bloodletting and bird fat. History can become very difficult to enjoy once you learn medieval medicine. One physician apparently suggests powdered gemstones for digestive problems. Imagine being wealthy enough to eat crushed sapphires and still dying from diarrhea. Civilization is astonishing sometimes. Your own village healer remains far more practical. Her remedies involve herbs, honey, rest, and occasionally yelling at people to stop eating spoiled fish. Honestly, her survival rates may rival royal physicians. Summer arrives warm and unusually peaceful. Years now pass without major raids nearby. The children swim in rivers, women gossip while washing clothes, men repair fences and complain about weather with almost spiritual dedication. Normal life. The great treasure humans consistently fail to appreciate while living inside it. One afternoon you sit beneath weak sunlight outside the hall while great-grandchildren play nearby, and suddenly you realize something strange. The sounds of fear have changed across your lifetime. In youth, fear sounded like ships. Later, it sounded like coughing. Then political arguments. Then silence beside an empty bed. Human beings do not outgrow fear. We merely exchange varieties. A local priest visits often now, not because you are dying immediately, though everyone politely understands the direction events generally move at your age. He mostly sits beside the fire, discussing scripture and village gossip with equal enthusiasm. One evening, he asks whether you still hate the Vikings. The question surprises you. You think carefully before answering. No, you finally say. Not because suffering vanished, not because losses stopped mattering, but because the people who once terrified their world became part of it eventually. Their children married your children, their language entered yours, their blood runs through grandchildren sleeping under your roof. Hatred becomes difficult to maintain across generations when everyone keeps becoming related accidentally. The priest nods thoughtfully, then admits his own grandfather was Danish. History again. Always mixing itself together while humans insist on categories. Autumn approaches quietly, fields golden beneath gray skies, smoke drifting lazily upward from chimneys. You spend more time resting now, more time remembering. The mind wanders strangely in old age. Certain moments remain painfully clear forever. Your husband laughing beside summer fields, the first ship emerging through fog, holding newborn children, burying tiny ones, rain dripping through forest leaves while families hid silently from raiders. Meanwhile, entire decades disappear into a blur. Perhaps memory preserves emotion more than chronology. One evening during harvest celebrations, music fills the hall softly. Children dance badly. Adults drink too much ale and become philosophical about sheep. You sit watching firelight flicker across generations of faces, and suddenly grief softens slightly around the edges, not disappearing, never disappearing, just settling into something quieter, part of the landscape now, like old scars. Your eldest great-grandson sits beside you, nearly a man grown already. He asks whether you think life was harder back then, a question impossible to answer cleanly, so you tell the truth. Life is always hard, you say, just in different directions. He considers this seriously. Young people always expect old people to possess clearer wisdom than they actually do. Mostly, you simply survived long enough to notice patterns. Outside, night settles gently across the village. No warning bells, no smoke, no ships. Only distant waves beyond dark hills and the soft breathing of sleeping children inside warm wooden walls. The world remains uncertain. Kings will continue fighting. Dynasties will continue marrying cousins until Europe collectively develops jaw problems. Winter will return. Disease will return. Loss will return. But tonight there is soup over the fire, family beside you, rain tapping softly against the roof. And after everything your long, weary life has witnessed, that feels almost unbelievably precious. Part 7. The Last Harvest, the Norman Rumors, and the deeply exhausting hobby of being English. You become aware of your own age in strange ways. Not through mirrors. Mirrors are rare and deeply unflattering anyway. No, you notice it when young mothers begin asking you advice with the careful seriousness once reserved for priests. You notice it when children stop laughing at your warnings and actually listen. And you notice it when people begin lowering their voices around you during winter illnesses, as though death itself might overhear. You are very old now by the standards of your world, old enough that survival has become a kind of accidental achievement. Most people you knew in youth are gone. The village itself barely resembles the frightened settlement where you once carried children into forests during Viking raids. There are more houses now, better roads, a small stone church replacing the old wooden one, trade routes busier than ever, and everywhere mixed bloodlines, Saxon names beside Danish names, faces carrying traces of both, history settling into the bones of ordinary people. The younger generation no longer speaks of Vikings with terror. Mostly they complain about taxes, which honestly may be civilization's final stage. One cold morning, your grandson returns from a regional gathering carrying enormous political gossip. Again, history truly cannot leave England alone for 5 peaceful minutes. Apparently, King Canute's sons are quarreling over succession, nobles shifting loyalties, foreign claims emerging. Normandy mentioned constantly now. Normandy, land of ambitious dukes and men with cheekbones sharp enough to cut rope. The Normans are descendants of Vikings too, though they now speak French and behave with tremendous confidence about absolutely everything. History's most successful rebranding effort, perhaps. Your grandson explains that many nobles distrust each other terribly. Some support one claimant, others another. Everyone swears loyalty publicly while preparing backup plans privately. The usual medieval political atmosphere, like a wedding where everyone secretly brought knives. You stir soup slowly while listening. After enough decades, royal instability becomes emotionally repetitive. Kings change, banners change, coins change, but ordinary people still wake up before dawn worrying about weather and bread. One great-granddaughter asks whether rulers ever notice common folk. You smile faintly, only when collecting taxes or soldiers. A harsh answer, perhaps, but not entirely wrong. Still, occasionally, good rulers matter enormously. Alfred mattered. Canute mattered. Competence at the top can soften suffering below. The problem is that history rarely distributes competence consistently. One afternoon, traders arrive with strange fabrics from farther south, fine dyed cloth, tiny glass beads, a comb carved in ivory. The village women gather around, touching everything with reverent fascination. Luxury remains magical in hard societies, not because people are shallow, because beauty becomes precious when life feels uncertain. Your youngest great-granddaughter stares longingly at blue cloth imported from overseas, bright as summer sky, entirely impractical. You secretly buy her a small strip anyway. Old people enjoy small rebellions. She wraps it into her hair immediately and spends the rest of the day walking around like a tiny queen. A good purchase. Meanwhile, illness moves through nearby towns again. Not plague exactly, just the endless medieval procession of fevers and infections, enough to remind everyone how fragile stability remains. You hear of a noble household losing 3 children within one winter, despite wealth, physicians, prayers, and imported medicines.
Money helps survival, but medieval medicine still resembles educated guessing mixed with alarming confidence. One aristocratic physician reportedly recommends hot goat milk mixed with powdered pearls for weakness. Imagine dying while someone feeds you jewelry. Your village healer continues relying mostly on herbs, clean bandages, and common sense, probably wiser overall. The priest speaks often now about preparing souls for heaven, not ominously, just realistically. In medieval society, death remains near enough that people discuss it the way modern people discuss weather: inevitable, variable, occasionally inconveniently timed. You do not fear death exactly, not anymore. Fear requires energy, and age slowly transforms terror into curiosity. Mostly, you wonder whether the people you loved are waiting somewhere beyond all this. Your husband, your mother, children lost long ago. The mind circles these thoughts quietly.
During sleepless nights, one evening, rain drumming softly outside, your family gathers close around the hearth while a traveler tells stories from Normandy about Duke William, a powerful ruler, disciplined, ambitious, apparently possessing the intense emotional energy of a man who has never once accepted hearing the word no. The traveler says William claims connections to the English throne through family lines. Several villagers groan immediately. Everyone understands what this means: future trouble. Royal family trees in Europe now resemble tangled fishing nets soaked in ego. Every ruler claims distant rights to somewhere, and eventually armies appear. One grandson asks why nobles constantly fight over crowns. The traveler shrugs. Crowns come with land. A deeply human explanation. Land means wealth, taxes, power, food, control. Strip away ceremony and medieval politics often becomes extremely aggressive property management. Outside, autumn rain turns roads into thick rivers of mud. Children lose shoes constantly. Carts break. Travel becomes miserable, which perhaps explains why medieval wars often paused seasonally, not from mercy, just logistics. Conquering kingdoms becomes difficult when your horse sinks into wet earth like a disappointed turnip. Your body weakens further that winter. Walking tires you quickly now. Sometimes your heart flutters strangely in your chest. The village women insist you rest more. You hate this advice immediately. Old age is deeply annoying because everyone suddenly treats standing up like a heroic achievement. Still, you accept help increasingly. Your granddaughter braids your hair now because your hands shake occasionally, a humiliating tenderness. One snowy evening, she asks what you miss most from youth. You expect yourself to say strength, or your husband, or certainty. Instead, the answer arrives unexpectedly. Time, you whisper. Not enough time for everyone. That is the tragedy beneath all history, really. Not wars, not kings, just how quickly entire lives vanish. Outside, snow covers fields where generations sleep beneath frozen ground. The same fields children now race across laughing during summer. Human existence layered endlessly upon itself. One morning, church bells ring unexpectedly. Not death bells, celebration. A local couple has welcomed healthy twin boys after years without surviving children. The entire village rejoices absurdly hard, because in difficult societies, healthy babies feel miraculous every single time. You attend the feast despite exhaustion. People sing terribly. Ale spills everywhere. One elderly man falls asleep directly into a pie. A beautiful evening. You sit quietly watching young parents hold their children near firelight, faces glowing with love and fear together, exactly as parents always have, across every century. One thing old age grants is perspective about continuity. Young people believe their emotions unique. Old people recognize repetitions. Every generation falls in love thinking nobody ever felt this intensely before. Every generation fears for children the same way. Every generation thinks the world is ending because politics became ridiculous again. And every generation is partially correct. News arrives during spring that tensions between England and Normandy continue growing. Claims, counterclaims, promises, threats. The names change, but the pattern remains familiar.
power attracting conflict like meat attracting flies. Your great-grandson trains now with local militia groups occasionally, not because invasion is certain, because invasion is always possible. England's unfortunate geographical hobby. He practices spear drills in muddy fields alongside other young men trying very hard to appear fearless. You watch them sometimes from a distance, so young, trying to stand like warriors while still emotionally children. History repeatedly hands boys weapons before wisdom. One evening, he asks whether fighting truly matters. You answer carefully. Protecting people matters. A subtle difference, perhaps, but important. He nods slowly, then admits he is frightened. You feel sudden fierce relief hearing this. Fear means he understands consequences. The truly dangerous men are often those who feel nothing at all. As years drift onward, the church grows wealthier and more organized. Stone buildings replacing wood. Latin prayers echoing through villages once filled with pagan fear of northern gods. And yet, traces remain. Old stories, old customs, little superstitions hidden beneath Christian rituals. Women still whisper charms during childbirth. Fishermen still make tiny offerings before dangerous voyages. Human belief systems layer rather than replace each other neatly. The priest pretends not to notice most of this, a practical man. One summer evening, unable to sleep, you step slowly outside beneath stars. The village rests quietly around you, smoke fading upward from dying fires, sheep muttering softly in distant fields, and beyond the hills, faintly, the sea. The same sea that once carried terror into your life. Now it sounds almost peaceful. You realize then how strange memory really is. The worst moments of your youth no longer feel sharp exactly, more dreamlike, mist and smoke and running footsteps through trees. Meanwhile, tiny, ordinary moments remain crystal clear. Your husband laughing after dropping fish into mud, children asleep beside the hearth, warm bread during winter, rain topping roofs while everyone breathed safely indoors. History remembers battles. Human beings remember evenings. Your breathing becomes difficult that autumn. Even short walks exhaust you. The family notices. Of course they notice. They begin speaking around you with careful gentleness again, preparing emotionally. You almost want to laugh. Nobody in your world truly expects permanent survival. Not after all these decades. Still, leaving remains hard. Not because you fear death, because you love life stubbornly despite everything. The smell of wood smoke, the sound of children, soup simmering over fires, cold morning air. Even grief itself becomes precious eventually, because it proves love existed. One afternoon, your great-granddaughter sits beside you spinning wool. She asks whether England will remain peaceful. You look towards the distant gray horizon through the doorway, then answer honestly, no. She seems disappointed, so you continue softly, but neither will anywhere else. This comforts her strangely, perhaps because old age teaches peace is never permanent, only temporary and therefore valuable. Outside, wind bends the tall grass silver beneath darkening skies. Somewhere across the sea, ambitious men continue discussing crowns and claims and inheritance rights. Norman ships are being built, armies imagined, historians preparing future chapters already. But here in this hall, for tonight at least, children sleep safely beneath blankets, while rain begins softly against the roof. And after one long lifetime of fear and survival and love and loss, that small, fragile safety still feels sacred enough.
The final winter, the Norman ships, and the long sleep of England. The winter arrives early, not dramatically. No black clouds rolling over hills, no prophetic ravens. Just cold, settling slowly into the world like an old familiar guest. The mornings whiten first, thin frost over fences, ice forming along water buckets. Children breathing smoke into dawn air while complaining loudly about chores. You sit near the hearth, wrapped in heavy wool, watching the village awake around you. Your hands tremble now, even when warm. Some mornings, your heart beats strangely fast for no reason at all. Other mornings, it feels tired,
as though your body itself has begun quietly preparing to leave. You are not afraid exactly, mostly curious and very, very exhausted. Outside, England drifts toward another storm. The rumors grow louder every week now. King Edward is aging, the succession uncertain. Harold Godwinson rising in power. William of Normandy still claiming promises were made to him. Across the sea, ambitious men stare at maps and imagine crowns, an ancient male lobby. Your great-grandson returns from a regional gathering carrying reports of shipbuilding in Normandy. Large preparations, warriors gathering, horses being loaded. Everyone immediately becomes tense, because England remembers ships. The younger generation has not lived through great invasions themselves, but the stories remain, always the stories. Your granddaughter sits beside you one evening mending clothes while rain murmurs softly outside. "Do you think it will happen?" she asks, quietly. You know what she means. Another invasion, another war, another turning of history's wheel. You stare into the fire for a long moment before answering. Yes. Not because prophecy fills you, because human beings rarely abandon opportunities for power peacefully, especially medieval nobles. Goodness, those people loved a succession crisis. Around the hall, children sleep tangled together beneath blankets while adults speak softly about politics. Harold, William, Norway too now apparently, another claimant, because apparently one invasion candidate was simply not enough excitement for England. You almost laugh. History truly treats this island like a toy passed between overly aggressive cousins. Outside, winter wind brushes against the walls, and suddenly memories return so strongly they almost hurt. The first Viking ships, your husband checking his spear, children crying in forests, smoke drifting across wet hills. You realize with strange sadness that your life has become a bridge between invasions, born into one age of fear, dying at the beginning of another. Human beings rarely notice historical eras changing while alive, but sometimes old people do. One afternoon, the priest visits carrying news from farther south. King Edward is dead. The room falls silent, not because everyone loved Edward deeply, but because royal deaths are like cracks appearing in frozen rivers. People immediately begin listening for worse sounds beneath the surface. Harold is crowned king quickly, very quickly. Too quickly, some whisper. Others defend him fiercely. The arguments spread everywhere. Markets, churchyards, alehouses. Everywhere, tired peasants try desperately to understand which powerful man they are expected to support now. You sit through these conversations feeling detached somehow. After enough decades, politics becomes weather. Important, certainly. Dangerous, often, but also cyclical. Your eldest surviving grandson prepares with local militia forces again, older now himself, gray appearing in his beard. You suddenly realize with shock that he now resembles your husband as a young man. Time performs these cruel little tricks constantly in old age. One evening, before leaving, he kneels beside your chair, exactly as his father once did, exactly as your husband once stood, generations folding over each other. "I'll return," he says. You smile softly, because young men always say this before war, as though promises influence spears. Still, you squeeze his hand and lie kindly. "I know." After he leaves, you sit awake long into the night listening to wind and distant waves. The house feels unbearably full of ghosts. Your husband, your sons as boys, babies sleeping beside fires, friends long buried, entire vanished worlds layered invisibly around you. Memory becomes crowded in old age, like carrying a village inside your chest. Spring comes late and cold. Then, suddenly, the news explodes across England. Harold has marched north against Norwegian invasion forces, a great battle, victory, exhausted celebrations spreading throughout the kingdom, people cheering in marketplaces, church bells ringing. Perhaps the danger has passed after all. And then, immediately, more news arrives.
William has landed in the south. Norman ships crossing the sea at last. Of course, because history refuses allowing England one uncomplicated week. The village erupts into anxious conversation, men gathering supplies, messengers racing roads, women exchanging frightened looks over bread dough and washing water. You recognize the atmosphere instantly, the old feeling returning again. Not panic exactly, preparation, the dreadful practical calm before violence arrives. Children notice adults whispering, they always do. One little boy asks whether the Normans are Vikings. The room becomes awkwardly quiet. Finally, you answer gently, a little, which honestly may be the most historically accurate explanation possible. The Normans are descendants of Norse settlers transformed by generations in France. Vikings wearing polished manners and expensive boots. Conquest evolves. One rainy evening, your great-granddaughter sits beside you, combing your thinning hair. You are too weak to do it yourself now. Outside, thunder rolls faintly over distant hills. Were you frightened, she asks, during the raids? You close your eyes, remembering. Fog, smoke, wet leaves, tiny hands gripping your sleeves. Yes, you whisper. She waits. But fear passes through people, you continue slowly. That's what it does. You survive it, then you carry it a while, then eventually you hand it to stories. She says nothing after that, just keeps combing gently while rain falls against the roof. Far away, armies move across England, Harold marching south after victory in the north, men exhausted already before the final battle even begins. Norman cavalry advancing through unfamiliar countryside, archers preparing arrows that future historians will discuss endlessly, and ordinary villagers everywhere hiding food and praying powerful men settle things quickly. Some things never change. Your body weakens sharply as autumn approaches. Walking becomes difficult. Eating tires you. The healer visits often now, bringing broths and herbs with the solemn kindness reserved for the very old. You appreciate her honesty. No false promises, no dramatic speeches, just comfort. One morning, church bells ring wildly from farther down the valley. Not local bells, news bells. Everyone stops working immediately. The sound spreads from settlement to settlement like nervous birds. Something enormous has happened. Hours later, riders arrive carrying the truth.
Harold is dead, defeated at Hastings. William victorious. England conquered again. The village absorbs this news strangely quietly, not because it lacks importance, because the scale feels too large suddenly, too final. Women continue kneading bread while staring blankly ahead. Men sit silently near walls. Children keep playing because children cannot comprehend history yet. You close your eyes hearing the words, another king, another conquest, another beginning wrapped inside an ending. And unexpectedly, you do not feel fear, only tired recognition, the wheel turning again. Norman rule arrives gradually in your region afterward. New lords, new taxes, French words entering noble speech, castles beginning to appear across landscapes like stone warnings, everything shifting once more. The younger villagers worry constantly about what comes next. You want to tell them something comforting, but old age values honesty more. The truth is that every generation inherits uncertainty. Always. One evening, your grandson finally returns home alive, older somehow, wearier. He speaks little about the fighting. Most survivors don't, not really. Instead, he describes practical details: mud, noise, confusion, how tired everyone felt. History in reality rarely resembles heroic paintings. Mostly it resembles exhausted, frightened people trying to not die in terrible weather. He sits beside your bed one night after others sleep. The England you knew is gone, he says quietly. You think about this for a long time, then shake your head slightly. No, you whisper, just changing. Because you understand something now that young people rarely can. Countries are not kings, not battles, not borders. They are people waking before dawn, making bread while children sleep nearby. They are stories repeated beside fires. They are grief carried across generations. They are languages blending slowly together in marketplaces. England survived Vikings by becoming partly Viking. Now it will survive Normans by changing again. History destroys and remakes simultaneously. Always. The final winter of your life settles softly over the village, snow drifting across rooftops, smoke rising into pale skies. You spend most days resting now, while family moves gently around you. Children instructed not to shout in your grandmother, though they still do occasionally. Thankfully, silence becomes too heavy otherwise. One night, your great-granddaughter curls beside you beneath blankets, nearly ground now. She asks whether you think people in the future will remember any of this. You smile faintly. The kings, maybe. And us? You look toward the dying fire, toward hands worn crooked from labor, toward generations sleeping safely because countless ordinary women kept children alive through centuries of fear. Then you answer softly, no. She seems saddened by this, but you are not, because history forgetting ordinary people does not mean they mattered less. In truth, kingdoms survive only because invisible lives continue beneath wars and crowns. Mothers carrying water, fathers repairing roofs, grandmothers telling stories while winter storms pass outside. That is the real foundation beneath every civilization. Near the end, sleep comes more often, long drifting sleeps filled with strange dreams. Your husband waiting beside summer fields, children laughing somewhere far away, the sea under gray skies, not frightening now, just endless. One dawn you wake briefly while snow falls softly beyond the doorway. The hall glows gold from early firelight, family sleeping nearby, safe, for now. And after a lifetime spent outrunning fear, surviving invasions, burying loved ones, and watching entire worlds rise and vanish, that feels enough. Outside, England enters another new age. Norman kings, stone castles, foreign nobles, future wars already waiting patiently beyond the horizon. But inside this small wooden hall, one old woman closes her eyes, listening to distant winter wind and the breathing of generations she helped carry through the dark. And slowly, very gently, the long, weary world drifts onward without her.
After the long sleep, the stone castles, and the children who forgot the fear. After you die, the world does what it always does. It continues. Not cruelly, not coldly, just steadily. The fire still needs feeding the next morning. Bread still must be baked. The goat still escapes its fence, because goats remain committed to chaos across all centuries. Your family weeps, of course. Your great-granddaughter cries hardest. The same girl who once sat beside you during storms, asking whether fear ever truly leaves people. Now she helps wash your body carefully with warm water while the priest murmurs prayers nearby. Outside, snow falls quietly over the village you spent nearly an entire lifetime watching change. The villagers gather for your funeral, wrapped in heavy cloaks against winter wind. Old neighbors lean on sticks. Children fidget impatiently. Babies cry at inconvenient moments, exactly as humans always do during solemn occasions. You are buried beside your husband, beneath frozen earth near the little stone church. Not a grand tomb, no carved monument, just another ordinary life folded gently back into the ground. And yet your family carries you forward anyway. That is how most human beings survive history, not through records, through memory. For a while, your name remains spoken often. The grandchildren repeat your stories. The great-grandchildren imitate your expressions. One little boy becomes convinced you once fought Vikings personally with a cooking spoon. No one fully corrects him because honestly, the story improves with retelling. The village changes faster after your death. Norman rule spreads deeply now. Stone replaces wood in many places. Castles rise across England like enormous gray threats pressed into the landscape.
Your great-grandsons hate the castles immediately, not because they are ugly, though many are, but because castles mean taxes, labor demands, new lords speaking French while peasants stand ankle-deep in mud pretending to understand. The Norman nobles arrive with polished armor, hunting dogs, and tremendous certainty about their own superiority, a deeply Norman energy. They build fortifications quickly because conquerors throughout history understand one universal truth. People become remarkably obedient when large stone buildings full of armed men appear nearby. Your great-grandson works hauling timber for one such castle during a harsh summer. The labor is brutal, the overseer's worse. He returns home furious nightly, muttering about Norman arrogance while eating enormous amounts of stew. Yet even this anger slowly changes over generations, because history softens edges eventually. Norman children grow up speaking bits of English. English children learn Norman words. Intermarriage begins. Trade expands. Again, the pattern repeats. Conquerors becoming neighbors. Neighbors becoming family. Human identities blending whether politics approves or not. Meanwhile, the old stories of Viking terror already begin drifting toward legend. Young children now hear them the way modern people hear ghost tales. Interesting, distant, almost unreal. That happens astonishingly quickly. Trauma rarely survives unchanged beyond a few generations unless constantly refreshed. One evening, your great-granddaughter, now a mother herself, tells her children about the time great-grandmother hid in forests while dragon ships burned villages. The children stare wide-eyed. One asks whether dragons were real. Another asks whether Vikings had tails. Human beings process history creatively. The mother laughs softly and shakes her head, but secretly she struggles remembering details exactly. Was the smoke thick or thin? Did the ships arrive before dawn or after? Memory frays at the edges surprisingly fast. And so history transforms. The emotional truth remains. The details drift. Far away, William the Conqueror tightens control over England. Land redistributed. Anglo-Saxon nobles replaced. Forest laws imposed. Castles spreading everywhere. The Doomsday Survey eventually records villages, fields, animals, obligations, an entire kingdom measured and categorized, which future historians adore. Meanwhile, peasants mostly experience it as strangers arriving to count chickens aggressively. One of your descendants later jokes that Norman governance mainly consists of writing things down while taxing them, a remarkably durable administrative strategy. The church changes too. Norman bishops replacing English clergy. New cathedrals rising enormous and cold over towns. Stone arches, Latin chants echoing through spaces vast enough to make ordinary villagers feel tiny. The old wooden churches of your youth already seem ancient now. Your family continues living much as before despite political transformations. Fields still need plowing, children still arrive loudly into the world. Winter still kills the weak, and women still carry the exhausting emotional burden of keeping families stitched together through chaos. One of your great-great-granddaughters becomes known locally for her healing skills, herbs, poultices, calm, practical wisdom. People begin saying she inherited the old grandmother's hands, meaning yours, though no portrait of you exists, no written record, only traces passed quietly through generations. That is how most of humanity survives time, as habits, as stories, as gestures, not names carved into history books. Norman and English cultures continue blending together over decades. The grandchildren of conquerors eventually complain about taxes in English accents, a deeply historical outcome. French words creep into noble speech. Court culture changes, fashion changes, food changes. Yet ordinary village life remains stubbornly continuous beneath all this. Mud, sheep, rain, soup, history's true constants. One winter, famine strikes several regions badly. Poor harvests, cold weather, food shortages. The villagers endure together as best they can. And during long nights beside weak fires, your descendants still repeat old family stories about raids, about survival, about the grandmother who once said fear becomes stories eventually. The line survives because it comforts people.
Long after your face is forgotten, clearly. Long after exact dates vanish. Certain sentences remain. Human beings are strange that way. A single phrase can outlive empires. Farther south, Norman kings continue producing their own deeply exhausting family dramas. William's sons eventually fight each other because medieval royal families possess an almost supernatural inability to enjoy stable inheritance. Brothers become enemies, alliances shift, wars erupt, again. Always again. One prince is brave but foolish, another intelligent but cruel, a third emotionally resembles wet parchment. Chroniclers describe them all with great seriousness, while ordinary people continue mostly worrying about weather. Your descendants observe royal politics the way farmers observe distant storms. Important, perhaps, but also exhausting and largely beyond control. One spring, decades after your death, an old man in the village claims he remembers you faintly from childhood. A bent woman with sharp eyes who spoke softly about ships. The younger villagers listen politely, but to them you already belong half to legend. That is the final transformation, a real human life slowly becoming folklore. The old man dies not long afterward, and with him disappears the last living memory of your actual voice. After that, only stories remain. Meanwhile, England itself keeps changing shape. Norman rulers become more English. English customs survive beneath Norman rule. Languages merge slowly into something new. The children of future centuries will speak words born from both conqueror and conquered, without realizing. History hides itself inside language like that. The sea remains, too. Always the sea. Cold gray water beyond the hills carrying traders, pilgrims, storms, fish, and future invasions patiently toward shore. Because England's relationship with the sea never truly settles. The same water that brings wealth also brings armies. Centuries later, other mothers will stand listening nervously to rumors of ships, Spanish ships, French ships, different flags, same fear. And always ordinary people adopting afterward, because that is what human beings do best. Adopt. Not gracefully, necessarily, not without grief, but persistently. One evening, your distant descendants gather during winter around another hearth in another version of England already almost unrecognizable from the world you knew. The language has changed, the clothes different, the politics more complicated somehow. Yet the scene remains familiar. Firelight, children half asleep, rain outside, stories being told softly through darkness. A grandmother speaks about ancestors who survived the old northern raids. The children listen with fascination. One asks whether the world was frightening back then, and the grandmother, carrying unknowingly the echo of your own wisdom across generations, smiles gently before answering. The world has always been frightening. Then, after a pause, and people have always continued anyway. Outside, winter wind moves across fields layered with centuries of forgotten lives, kings buried beneath cathedrals, peasants beneath unmarked earth. Whole villages vanished, whole dynasties dust. But the human rhythm continues. Children born, bread baked, stories told, fear survived. And somewhere beneath all the stone castles and royal chronicles and battles historians love recording, the invisible life you lived still lingers quietly inside the world that came afterward. Not as a famous queen, not as a saint, not as a warrior, just as one tired mother among millions who carried children through dark, uncertain years and kept going long enough for history to become memory instead of terror, which, honestly, may be the greater achievement. The forgotten woman, the written history, and the end that was never really an end. Long after the castles stop being new, people begin thinking they have always existed. Stone has that effect. It makes change feel like permanence. Generations are born beneath their shadows and assume the world has always been tall and gray and heavily taxed. Your name is gone now from most human memory. Not erased in any dramatic sense, just gently dissolved through time the way smoke disappears into sky without ever announcing its departure. But you are still there, not as a person anyone remembers clearly, but as traces, a habit in a family, a phrase said during storms, a way of lighting fires carefully so smoke doesn't sting eyes too much. Small inherited behaviors that no one questions anymore. That is how most lives survive history, not through records, through repetition. England, now under Norman rule for many decades, has changed into something new enough that older distinctions barely matter anymore. Anglo-Saxon and Norman have blended into a single messy identity, slowly forming across centuries. Languages fuse, families merge, old grievances fade into half-remembered stories told beside fires for entertainment rather than anger. Even the memory of Viking terror has softened further. Now it lives mostly in songs and cautionary tales for children. Do not wander too far from home, parents say, or the old sea raiders will take you. Children nod solemnly, then immediately ignore the warning and wander too far anyway. Human nature remains impressively consistent. Across England, monasteries copy older chronicles, monks carefully writing histories that try to make sense of everything that came before. They mention kings, wars, battles, treaties, names of men who held crowns, but very rarely do they mention people like you, a woman who never ruled anything, who never commanded armies, who simply survived. And yet, without people like you, none of those kings would have had kingdoms left to rule. History forgets its foundations because foundations are not meant to be seen. One monastery in particular, centuries later, preserves fragments of earlier oral stories. Faint references, a woman of the northern coasts who hid children during raids, a survivor of the sea wolf years. The details are wrong, blurred, mixed with legend, but something remains, a shape of memory, a silhouette of endurance. And over time, that silhouette becomes part of the region's folklore, not accurate, but emotionally true. Meanwhile, England continues its long, complicated journey through medieval history. More kings, more disputes, more foreign wars, more marriages designed for politics rather than affection. The Norman line eventually intertwines with English nobility so thoroughly that distinctions begin to blur entirely. Future rulers will no longer think of themselves as conquerors, just as kings, which is how conquest always ends, not with victory, but with forgetting. In villages like the one you once lived in, life continues in a rhythm that would feel familiar even centuries later. Fields still require labor. Children still arrive crying into cold air. Winter still punishes the poor most severely. And old women still sit near fires telling stories that make younger generations briefly feel both afraid and safe at the same time. One such winter, long after your time, a storyteller in a small wooden hall speaks about the old mother of the forest years. She is not named, not precisely, but everyone understands who she is meant to be. A woman who led children into woods during the first sea raids, who survived famine winters, who outlived fear itself long enough for fear to become history. The children listening lean closer, not because they understand history, but because they understand survival. That part has never needed translation. Outside, snow falls steadily over England, over fields that once saw ships through fog, over rivers where refugees once hid, over forests where frightened families once waited in silence. Everything covered gently now, everything softened. The storyteller finishes speaking and the fire burns low. One child asks what happened to her in the end. The storyteller hesitates, then answers honestly in the way old stories sometimes do when they no longer need precision. She lived, he says, and then she was no longer afraid. Which is not a factual ending, but it is a human one, and perhaps that is enough, because the truth of your life was never meant to be contained in royal chronicles or battle records or written laws. It lived in smaller things, in hands warming children, in bread shared during winters, in warnings whispered near shorelines, in quiet endurance through years that asked too much from ordinary people.
Centuries later, historians will debate kings and battles and successions. They will argue about Harold and William and Canute and Alfred. They will reconstruct invasions and dynasties and political shifts with careful precision. And they will be right about those things, but they will still be missing something essential. The feeling of waking up in fog not knowing if today is safe. The sound of children hiding breathlessly in forests. The quiet exhaustion of a life spent balancing fear and necessity. That part survives only in fragments, in stories, in echoes, in imagination, and in the faint inherited memory of all the people who came after you without ever knowing your name. The world continues turning. England becomes something larger, more organized, more structured. Kingship becomes institutional. Castles become administrative centers. Wars become recorded history instead of living terror. And gradually, over centuries, the Viking ships fade completely from lived memory. They remain only in sagas and books, not as reality, but as story. And somewhere beneath all that history, beneath the written chronicles and royal genealogies and carved stone monuments, your life still exists in the only way ordinary lives ever truly do. Not as greatness, but as continuity. A long chain of small choices to survive one more winter, to feed one more child, to endure one more uncertain dawn. And that, in the end, is what carried England from fear into history. Not kings, not conquerors, not chronicles, but millions of unnamed people who simply kept going long enough for everything to become something else. So when the storytellers finish, and the fire burns down to embers, and the children fall asleep one by one in the warmth of a wooden hall, the world outside remains the same world you once knew, cold, uncertain, still shaped by the sea, but now softened by time. And if you listen closely in the silence between generations, you might almost hear it. Not the sound of invasion, not the sound of kings, but the quiet rhythm of ordinary life continuing anyway, breath after breath, winter after winter, story after story, until even fear itself finally grows tired and becomes, at last, only memory.
The sea forgets its names, and England learns to dream in stone. By the time people stop telling your story correctly, they have already stopped needing it to be correct. That is how memory works. It becomes useful before it becomes accurate, and comforting before it becomes useful again. England, now many generations removed from the world you lived in, has changed in the way landscapes change when no one is watching closely enough day by day. Not suddenly, never suddenly, just steadily, like tides smoothing footprints from sand. Castles now dominate the countryside, not new anymore, not impressive anymore, just there, stone habits of power. Villages cluster beneath them, adjusting like moss growing around an old tree that no one remembers planting. People are born into this world without imagining anything different. To them, stone walls are normal, armed men are normal, taxes are normal. Even language feels normal now in its blended form, no longer fully English as you knew it, no longer fully Norman either, just something else entirely, something that evolved from both conquest and survival. The old Viking stories still exist, but they have softened into children's tales. Sea wolves in sagas, longships in songs, monsters that arrive when children misbehave. The fear has been domesticated, turned into bedtime warnings rather than lived experience. And perhaps that is the final victory of time over trauma, not erasure, but reduction. Far away, monks continue writing chronicles, carefully, patiently. They describe kings and wars and successions with solemn authority. They name rulers in long sequences as though naming alone can explain what happened. They mention invasions as events, not experiences. They mention battles as outcomes, not fear. And so history is written in a way that slowly removes the human trembling from it. Your life does not appear in these texts, not because it did not matter, but because it did not fit. No crown,
No battlefield command, no treaty signed in Latin, just survival. And survival is rarely recorded unless it becomes myth. Still, myths begin forming anyway. In one region, an old oral tale survives longer than most. A woman who led children into forest when ships came through fog. A protector during the sea-burning years. Different versions disagree about her name. Some call her a widow. Some call her a healer. Some call her simply the mother who did not leave. The story spreads slowly through generations, reshaped each time it is told. Details shift, facts blur, but the emotional core remains intact. A woman, a forest, children hidden from burning ships, and survival. Always survival. Centuries later, scholars will argue about whether she existed. They will search chronicles, compare manuscripts, find nothing conclusive, and eventually conclude she was likely symbolic, which is both correct and incomplete, because symbols usually begin as people. Meanwhile, England itself continues its long transformation. Kings come and go. Wars shift across borders. Languages evolve further still. The Norman aristocracy gradually stops thinking of itself as Norman. They become English without fully noticing the transition. Their children grow up speaking the local tongue. Their grandchildren forget the sea crossing entirely. Conquest dissolves into identity so completely that future generations will argue about whether conquest ever truly happened the way older records claim. History always does this. It slowly edits itself into something livable. In villages like the one you once knew, life continues in ways that would feel familiar even across centuries. There is still planting, still harvesting, still illness that arrives without permission, still winters that test the limits of stored grain and human patience, still fires around which stories are told. Only now, the stories include kings from both sides of your lifetime, English and Norman mixed together in memory, the way flour and water become dough. One winter evening in a wooden hall not unlike yours, but built generations later, an old storyteller speaks to children gathered close to a hearth. He describes raids that came from the sea. He describes fear moving through villages like wind. He describes children hidden beneath trees while ships burned along the shore. The children listen quietly. Some shiver. Some lean closer. One asks if she was brave. The storyteller pauses, then answers carefully. No, he says. She was tired, and she kept going anyway. The children think about this. It does not sound heroic in the way they expect heroes to sound, but it feels real in a way stories rarely manage. Outside, snow falls across a world that has forgotten its earlier selves. Kings now think in administration. Churches think in structure. Villages think in survival. And somewhere beneath all of it, the long history of ordinary people continues like a current under ice, unseen, constant, powerful in its persistence rather than its force. And in that continuity, your life continues too, not as memory, not as name, but as pattern. A pattern repeated in every generation that follows. A mother listening at night for danger that may never come. A family gathered around fire, pretending certainty exists. A community rebuilding again after hardship. A child learning the world is both frightening and survivable at the same time. That is the inheritance left behind when everything else is stripped away. Not kingdoms, not crowns, not chronicles, just endurance. And over time, even endurance becomes ordinary, so ordinary that no one thinks to record it. By the time the Normans have fully blended into England, the language itself has changed enough that even old words for fear and safety sound slightly different. But the feeling remains the same. Somewhere, a mother still listens to distant wind at night. Somewhere, children still sleep too deeply to understand danger. Somewhere, old women still sit near fires remembering winters that younger people cannot fully imagine. And somewhere, beyond all the rewritten histories and rebuilt castles and renamed kingdoms, the sea still moves against the land as it always has. Cold, endless, unbothered by human names. It carried invaders once. It carries merchants now. It will carry something else later. The world never stops changing its vocabulary. Only its rhythm stays the same. And if there is anything left of you at all in this distant future, it is not in stone, not in text, not in power. It is in that rhythm, the quiet act of surviving one more night, one more winter, one more uncertain dawn, until even fear forgets how to hold itself together and becomes, finally, just another story told softly in the dark. Next.
The end of the story that never ends. At some point, even stories about you begin to change shape in ways you would probably find mildly irritating, not because they are cruel, but because they become too neat, too arranged, too willing to make meaning out of something that when you lift it, mostly felt like cold mornings, tired hands, and hoping the bread didn't burn. By now, England is far removed from the frightened landscape of your earliest years. The sea still exists, of course. It always does. But it no longer feels like a doorway for invasion, more like a boundary for trade, a moving horizon that brings goods instead of terror, at least most of the time. The castles are everywhere now. Stone has become the language of authority. Villages exist under them like careful thoughts under a very serious idea. People are born into this structure and assume it has always been this way. They do not imagine forests filled with hiding families. They do not imagine ships appearing through fog like threats given form. They do not imagine what it felt like when survival was uncertain enough to be a daily conversation, because history, once stabilized, edits out its own panic. Monasteries continue writing. Kings continue ruling. Wars continue happening, though now with more paperwork attached. And somewhere in the long chain of scribes and storytellers, your existence becomes something softer, not erased, just transformed. A figure in an old tale, a symbol of endurance, a mother of uncertain name who lived through the sea-burning years. That is how it is said now. The details have fully surrendered to time. But strangely, the emotional shape of your life has survived more accurately than any fact. People still understand what it means. Fear arriving from the sea, children hidden in forests, a life spent worrying about danger that pass while still needing to feed the living. That part never changes. Across generations, storytellers refine the tale further. Sometimes she's a healer, sometimes a widow, sometimes simply the old woman who knew the forest paths. Always the same core, always survival, always endurance, and always, without exception, she is calm. Not because you were calm, but because stories prefer calmness. Chaos is harder to pass down. In another century, scholars debate whether such a woman could have existed. They search records, find nothing definitive. They conclude she is likely mythologized, a composite memory of many people. And they are right, and also not, because you were one person among many, and many people together become indistinguishable over time. That is how ordinary life survives history, not as individuality, but as accumulation. Meanwhile, England itself has fully absorbed its earlier identities. The Norman and English distinction fades into something else entirely. Language shifts again and again until even the way people describe fear changes slightly. No one speaks of Vikings anymore except as distant history. No one imagines them as real in the way you once did. They belong to story now, not experience. The world has successfully domesticated its own terror. One winter evening, in a hall warmed by a broad hearth, a storyteller continues the tradition without knowing its origin. Children sit close, listening to a tale that has been retold so many times it no longer has edges. He speaks of the mother of the northern woods, a woman who guided children away from burning shores, a woman who survived winters where others did not, a woman who never stopped moving forward, even when fear followed behind her like smoke. The children listen as children always do, half afraid, half fascinated. One asks if she ever became important. The storyteller thinks for a moment, then smiles faintly. No, he says, she became remembered. And that, in this world, is the closest thing to immortality anyone ever receives. Outside, the wind moves across fields that once knew panic and now only know seasons. Snow falls over old boundaries no one recognizes anymore. The sea continues its endless motion beyond the hills. It does not remember ships. It does not remember raids. It does not remember you. But the land does, in its own quiet way. Because every field that was rebuilt after burning carries that history in its soil. Every village that survived carries it in its layout. Every family that continued carries it in its habits. Survival leaves no monument, only continuation. And so, at the end of everything that was your life, there is no final dramatic conclusion, no last revelation, no perfect closure. Only this: a long chain of winters endured, a long chain of children raised, a long chain of fear slowly transformed into story. And somewhere inside that chain, your name dissolving gently into something larger than memory, you remain present not as a figure in history, but as part of its structure, the part that held, the part that continued, the part that refused to stop even when everything around it suggested stopping would be easier. And long after kings are forgotten and castles crumble into softened ruins and languages shift into forms you would not recognize at all, that quiet persistence remains. Not written, not crowned, not recorded, just lived. Again and again and again. Until even the idea of endings feels unnecessary. Because the story was never really about how it stops, only about how it keeps going. Next. There isn't really a next in the historical sense anymore. This is where the story stops pretending it has a final chapter. Because if we keep going forward from here, we're no longer following your life or even your memory. We're just watching the same pattern repeat under different names. Castles become towns. Towns become cities. Cities forget the fields they were built on. Kings turn into governments. Governments turn into systems. Systems turn into routines nobody questions anymore. And somewhere in all of that, the same quiet thing continues underneath it all. People still wake up before dawn, still worry about food and weather, still listen for trouble at night that rarely comes, still bury their dead, still raise children who believe their time is the most complicated time that ever existed. It always feels new to the people inside it. That's the trick. History never really ends in a clean way worth a final episode. It just thins out. The fear becomes less physical. The survival becomes less immediate. The stories become more polished and less lived. And eventually, even the story of the frightened mother in the Viking years becomes something people tell softly, almost politely, like it happened to someone somewhere a long time ago, rather than to a real person who once stood in cold mornings, wondering if her children would survive the week. But the point of this entire long, slow narration was never to reach a dramatic ending. It was to sit inside that repetition long enough to notice something underneath it. That the world didn't move forward because of kings or invasions or grand turning points. It moved forward because ordinary people kept doing ordinary things while those events happened above their heads. So if you're expecting a last twist or a last revelation or a neat emotional conclusion where everything resolves into meaning, history doesn't really cooperate with that. It just keeps going, like it always has, like it still does. And somewhere in that endless continuation, your life, this imagined life, this stitched together survival across storms and winters and changing kingdoms, doesn't end so much as it fades back into what it always was. A single human thread in a long, very tired, very persistent story that never learned how to stop. And that's probably the closest thing it ever gets to an ending.